This is Spirit Gym. Today's guest is Dr. John Churchill. Dr. Churchill's interest in psycho-spiritual development, integral theory, contemplative studies, Western esotericism, and Mahayana Buddhism began in his adolescence, eventually leading him to spend several years as a Buddhist monk in Scotland. For the last 25 years, John has developed a fourth-turning planetary Dharma practice, which includes the somatically based contemplative practice path, embodying the open ground, that integrates psychodynamic healing, adult development, and meditation. He is also a founding member of the Integral Institute, led by esteemed transpersonal integral philosopher Ken Wilber. Thank you for listening to this podcast, which would not be possible without you, our subscribers, and also our premier sponsors, Wild Pastures, Paleo Valley, Bioptimizers, and Organifi. The sponsors' special offers and discounts are mentioned throughout this episode, or you can visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast. Today in this episode, Paul and John are discussing the evolution of consciousness.
Okay, well, as you heard from Penny's intro, we have a very deep, highly educated, very interesting man today, John Churchill. And I learned about John from one of my Spirit Gym students who wrote me a message saying, Paul, you really should interview John because the concepts that he teaches are the same as you, but he takes a different approach. So I get the benefit of seeing from multiple different angles by having both of you as teachers. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I looked you up, John, and found you on Andre DeComb's excellent podcast and watched that and thought, well, yeah, John's definitely got some substance and some depth and the kind of guy I like to have a good rap session with. So I put a podcast together today called The Evolution of Consciousness. And so as we were discussing, we were going to see how far we get through the outline. But welcome, John. It's great to be able to share some space-time and time-space with you.
Likewise, Paul. Thanks for inviting me. Looking forward to us jamming together.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, I'd love the audience to get a sense of who you are and what shaped you and how you came to the views that you will share today. So can you share some of your background, developmental history? And I'd love everyone to hear, and I'd love to hear if you could encapsulate at the end of all that what your spiritual philosophy is, if you have one. You can give us the Reader's Digest version if you want.
Okay, so the first question was, how did I come to the views that I have today? Like, what's my...
Yeah, just sort of what's your background? What shaped you to be John?
Wow. Well, obviously so many things.
Yeah.
Just starting with my, kind of upbringing. I grew up in the UK. I'm half English, half Dutch. I started on this journey relatively young. First memories are of out-of-body experiencing as a child around the house.
Cool.
And I was lucky that I had a grandmother who had been, she was quite an extraordinary woman. She was a Olympic downhill skier. She skied in whatever the Nazi Olympics was, she skied for the Netherlands. She was a student of Jung's and
very good
practitioner. So I was lucky enough to, starting around 12, to have kind of mentoring from her, and also a mother who really supported my interests. So there was a kind of a supportive family environment.
Great. Rare.
Yeah, and on the other hand, my dad had a degree in analytical chemistry from Cambridge. So I was well suited to both, let's say, have direct experience and then also reflect upon that and ask questions.
Sounds to me like you had both sides of your brain connected by your family.
Well, both sides of my brain is connected by my family. That's right. So I'm grateful for that environment. So I did the whole young upper class going to boarding school when I was 7. So that had a huge impact on me in terms of I got a very elite education.
Great.
And also some good attachment injuries along with it.
Well, you had to have something to work on.
Yeah, for sure. And I started my kind of, let's say, interest in these areas as soon as I could start reading. So it's been consciousness, human development, evolution has been something that I've been like just deeply interested from the very beginning. Had a pretty strong awakening when I was around 17. That definitely had a very, big impact on me. And we can kind of like unpack something like that if you wanted. Travel, yeah.
Oh, what was the awakening? It makes me wonder if you've used psychedelics.
I've used psychedelics, but I wasn't using psychedelics at the time. Psychedelics happened a lot later. I was kind of like I was a bit old. I'm a bit old school,
Yeah.
in some of these areas, like in the sense that the kind of growth and development that I'm interested in, I believe it's measured in years and decades and not in peak experiences. And so I've always that's been my kind of my main approach, if you will, is kind of more traditional.
Yeah.
Although I've definitely enjoyed psychedelics.
Yeah.
So I then spent time studies in in Tibetan Buddhism. Spent a short career as a Tibetan monk. Came to the United States when I was like 22 to study at Naropa, which is a kind of a contemplative university here in Colorado. So, obviously those early years, they tend to shape us the most. And then, since then, I've been lucky to have a series of, good teachers and continued my studies, and both in kind of Asian medicine and Western psychology. So those are my kind of influences.
You said you had 3 degrees related to psychology, correct?
That's right. Yeah, I have a bachelor's and a master's and a PsyD.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was there a field of study specifically that you looked into?
Well, my interest has always been in where kind of like my PsyD, my doctoral thesis was in what is it? It was ego development, contemplative psychology, and meditative processes. So it's my interest has always been in the intersection between Western developmental psychology, contemplative practice, and that's the field. Like, what does the new psychology look like?
Right.
Yeah.
What would you say your living spiritual philosophy is?
Well, that's a big question, Paul.
I'm good at that.
Yeah. Well, there's both a kind of personal dimension to that, and then there's also the how does that get played out in the world?
Yeah, that's usually the case.
So I think what I would say is, my living spiritual philosophy is that of what we would call the Bodhisattva path, Bodhisattva practice, which has both a kind of non-dual contemplative dimension, a developmental dimension, and then a way of understanding that the path unfolds through a particular non-dual engagement with the world itself, meaning that there's a relationship between what the alchemists would call the anima mundi, the soul of the world, and one's own individual soul. And so the soul-making process, if you will, or the developmental process happens through interacting and following the path in the world. So in that sense, teaching, living, helping this world grow. I mean, I really believe that we're here to help birth the sacred into this realm, if you will. I'm not really, an ascender in the idea that we're trying to get somewhere else. Rather, we're actually trying to allow the sacred to flower, if you will, into this planetary system at this particular point in time. So a lot of my living philosophy is related to how do we support a fundamental phase shift in humanity so that we can stop destroying ourselves and grow towards something of more of a unified planetary civilization and consciousness.
Yeah, well, everything you've just described is a very strong parallel to my own way of relating, and I can see why our common student said what they said after kind of hearing this introduction from you. So that's fantastic. I think that lays the foundation for a real good dialogue. Of all the people you've studied or been a student to, whose views on consciousness have been the most influential to you?
I love when I saw that question I was like, oh God.
Yeah, it's hard when sometimes because people like you and I study a lot. So,
well, I mean, my fundamental teacher, I would say, is like Shakyamuni Buddha, and Longchenpa, and Gampopa, and Tsongkhapa. So these are the great kind of Tibetan masters. Then within kind of Indian psychology, like Ramana Maharshi, Sri Aurobindo.
Right. Yeah. Love them both.
Right. Really well grounded in Carl Jung, Freud, Reich, Adler, Asciuoli. In terms of Western contemporary psychologists, Michael Commons, his work on hierarchical complexity. So that's out of the kind of Piaget school.
I'm not familiar with him. You got me there.
Okay. So he's I think he's at Harvard, out of Harvard, a cognitive developmentalist, who really focuses on levels of cognitive complexity.
Neat.
Yeah, and then obviously my friend Ken Wilber.
Yeah.
My late mentor, Dr. Dan Brown.
Right. Yeah.
I've really deeply appreciated the work of Hamid Ali, who founded the Diamond Approach and did a lot of really good work integrating like Western psychodynamics and developmental and kind of spiritual development. And then, of course, there's influences in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and things like alchemy. But I'm well read and well studied, so there's a lot of streams.
Yeah.
That I kind of hold, if you will.
Yeah, I live that way too. Sometimes you don't. I don't know if you've had this experience, but you don't realize sometimes where your views or ways of relating or conclusions, you don't realize where they came from until all of a sudden you go back and read a book you haven't read for 10 years and you go, oh my God, I don't even remember reading that. But it's somehow forefront in the way you see the world. And
yeah, absolutely. And I don't, I often, the way that I relate to a lot of these texts is that there's also a kind of, for me, there's a Western developmental perspective that I hold, but then there's also a kind of multi-incarnation perspective that I hold because I'm well grounded. That's kind of my larger meta narrative. And so there's also, we get to a certain age, as we are, Paul, where you can actually look back and reflect upon your own consciousness, even like from, 15, 20, and you can see. So when I look back and I look at where I was and how things are, and now I'm, in my 50s, I can see how all of those references to kind of teachers, they were all already there as part of like a kind of implicit way of seeing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And all those teachers really helped me recognize ways that I already saw things.
Yeah.
So I do believe that, you, I, and our listeners, like growth, that there's growth that happens in a lifetime, and there's growth that really happens over a much longer story.
Sure.
And so, we really are legion, we there's a lot going on in each of us.
Yes, there is.
Yeah.
I think too, on that note, I think there's a lot of pay dirt, so to speak, in spending enough time in, with, and aware of your inner self to begin to recognize where things like past life influences are coming through.
Yeah. I wouldn't have spoken about that or even really been interested in that until I was in my like late 40s.
Mm-hmm.
Because before that, it's just a bunch of narcissism. I think it was when I had enough turf behind me to turn around and say, okay, clearly, whatever it is that I'm doing, we're also a byproduct of a kind of objective process. It's like you inherited Paul. Right? You know what I mean? I mean, you were like, shit, I've got to do Paul this lifetime. And then at a certain amount of time, you look back and you're like, oh yeah, that's what Paul looks like.
Yeah.
Right? I think you can only do that after at least, like 4 or 5 decades.
Yeah, it takes a while.
Yeah, before that, it's kind of like, get your finger out of the poop, leave that alone.
Yeah.
Grow up.
Yeah. I think it takes a while to go from externalizing the soul to realizing that you keep making the same mistakes over and over again, and you got to go sit under a tall tree and think about it for a while and get brave enough to say, how did I create that?
Well, and the other piece of it is you get to a certain age and you're like, maybe I'm over the top. And the speed that's gathering now is the speed that's gathering towards an exit strategy.
Yeah.
And then those questions become real. I think that's Carl Jung. There's something about this. The psyche has its own like speed of maturation. You cannot hothouse, right? Like I have a bunch, in terms of students, I've heard a bunch of like new age, nice new age ponytail guys, and then 60-year-old bankers. And I always prefer the 60-year-old bankers because actually their psyches are a lot they're a lot riper.
Yeah.
They might not have the right diet, and they might not, like have the right clothing or the haircut, right? Or any of that shit. But their psyche, they've done life. And so they're really ready in a quite a different way than if you're in your 20s or 30s.
Yeah, I think the first group is more about accomplishing and trying to establish who am I and keep up with the Joneses. But the second group you described is more really, there's an honest willingness to figure it all out. And like you said, like I'm 63, so I remember going through my 50s and you kind of all of a sudden come to the realization, I'm actually going to fucking die one day.
Well, hopefully it's like, thank God.
Well, yeah, if you've done the right practices, that's the attitude,
It's like, I'm going to die, thank God, because
yeah, you need a rest. The show gets tiring after a while, but
the Paul show and the John show, it's like, oh my God, I am ready to put this down.
Yeah, I was really ready, but then Great Spirit threw me a curveball and gave me 2 kids, and I like, okay, with the world these kids are coming into, I got to keep my shit together and make sure that before I leave, they got a toolkit or they're going to be screwed.
They are, and the way I like to look at it, and And you better build yourself a good landing strip, because you're going to be back for more. So then he's like, no, he's like,
I'm in no rush for more. I've had a long conversation with my soul about let's not do this too quickly. When the pandemic started and the world was just going fucking bonkers, and I'm an ex-paratrooper, so I have battlefield strategy training, and I knew this is a war we're in. This is not a fucking pandemic, and people were completely oblivious to it.
mm-hmm.
And so I went into meditation. I said to my soul, this is about 2 years in this point that I'm talking about now. I said, did we know this shit was going to happen?
Hell yeah.
When we came in? And my soul said, that's exactly why you came in. I said, oh my God, what is wrong with me? So too funny. But anyhow, yeah, well, I think we see eye to eye on plenty already.
Is it must be your love of tobacco must come from your parachuting days.
No, I practiced shamanism and I have 2 wives. Angie's a very skilled shaman, and I did a year of training in the use of plant medicines with a doctor in 2006, and then I became qualified through the Native American Council to do it legally, and I've conducted about 1,000 or more ceremonies since then. But I just fell in love with the tobacco spirit. I do a lot of writing and a lot of course development and a lot of filming. Like, my life is extremely busy. So I just found the tobacco spirit is really like synergistic and coherent. I feel really aligned with it. And when I went through my midlife crisis at 50, I just reached the point where I just didn't want to be around people anymore. And I just thought, you can't, I realized it took me 50 years to realize you can't fix the world. And I'd tried so hard, but I just made a promise to myself, I'm not going to work anymore unless I can make it fun. And so when I blow a bag of smoke, it's my reminder, you're choosing to do this. And this is a symbol that you're having fun. So it's more of
I love that.
For me, it's more of I let the plant spirits support me so that I can help people more aware of the importance of living in harmony with the planet and nature. And so we have an equal trade deal. The spirits join me, and then they speak through me, and I write what they want to say. So, since we're exploring the evolution of consciousness within human beings today, I thought we could start by having you share one or more definitions of what consciousness is, so that we're not kind of leaving it so loose and fluffy that it's too new age for anyone to really make any meaning out of it. But a lot of people say there's no definitions for consciousness, but I don't believe that myself. But I'm just curious, how do you, in other words, when you use that word, what exactly are you talking about?
That's a good question. To say there's no definitions, clearly the word has an etymology.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? So conscere means basically with knowing, but typically scary would mean discernment. So, typically what that term would mean the operations of the mind or the human being, particular to the kind of like a intelligent process related to discernment. So, for me, that's consciousness itself is, let's say, a structure. That includes the attentional system. It includes the self structure. It includes memory. I wouldn't necessarily include the nature of awareness itself as part of that structure, because consciousness evolves, if you will, and awareness doesn't. It is. So I would put those in a larger package, but I typically refer to consciousness as like some of the fundamental operations of, like you have human consciousness and snake consciousness. Well, they're both aware,
Yeah.
So it's not awareness, it is the particular nature and structure of human consciousness. And then within that, we would say, well, there's levels of development of that consciousness.
Yeah.
So for me, it's got to do with the structures of the psyche, those structures pertaining to both developmental structures and also structures that facilitate basic fundamental human operations.
Yeah.
Does that sound about?
Yeah, no, I think that's very good. I have a very similar but slightly different approach. What you're referring to as awareness as separate from consciousness without a long backstory, I call that big C in all caps.
Okay.
To kind of lean back on Arthur M. Young, Arthur M. Young says non-being is significant because it is aware of being. And I think there's a lot of value in that statement. So in my model, big C is non-being or pure subject, and little c is any phenomena that can be perceived by a sentient being.
I agree.
And so that's kind of how I break it down, because there's a lot of people that kind of get into, word fighting over whether, the awareness factor is conscious or whatever. And you know how it is with pundits. They're always playing hockey with words. But
sure,
a lot of my work is what I do, and I'm sure you do the same, I suspect, is I study, but then I go internally and I ask my soul to guide me as to how can I look at this from an internal objective perspective that I can put my hands on and touch metaphorically, so that if I can't find something that a teacher like Jung or any of them is pointing to in myself, then I still feel like I'm really just cutting and pasting ideas and I don't really have any authentic knowing. So I don't feel good about teaching that to people because it's just too flimsy,
Sure. I think that's for myself, the wonderful thing about particularly the Indo-Tibetan Academy. And so the Indo-Tibetans really inherited like the whole of Indian Buddhism. So Tibet inherited the whole of Indian Buddhism, and Indian Buddhism was essentially the first university tradition. And they had, if you think of, in some ways, mysticism or contemplative practice is the ultimate phenomenology. It's the ultimate exploration of pure subjectivity. And the difference between the politics in the East and the West was, in the West, the church was very threatened by the mystics, and essentially isolated them in separate monasteries. And so because of that, if you look at St. Teresa, St. John of the Cross, Meister Eckhart, these great explorations of human consciousness, they had to develop their own language themselves.
Just like the alchemists.
So when you do that, you don't develop a science. In order to develop a science, you have to have an agreed upon lexicon.
Yeah.
So the difference between the East, the kind of, let's say, the Western Academy of like deep phenomenology is we don't have one, as opposed to, when you learn from, what I learned from my Tibetan teachers was that a term meant something in direct experience. So if you have 100 terms that are referring to different dimensions of direct experience, and then you have practices injunctions that you can then engage in, and then you have a language that is very precise. So the very fact that we have to begin by asking, like, well, what's your definition of consciousness?
Yeah,
it's because our academy was so fractured that we were never able to develop a sophisticated enough kind of contemplative phenomenology, as opposed to those traditions where, the language itself is psychoactive, meaning if there's a term that refers to something that is real, and you get introduced to the term and then pointed out to what it means in your direct experience, suddenly, every time you're using that word, you're kind of pointing to something that is real.
If you've been listening to this podcast for any length of time, you've probably heard Paul raving about one of his absolute go-to supplements, P3OM from Bioptimizers. Well, they've given it a new name, Probiotic Breakthrough. It's the same amazing formulation, just with a new name. Here's a chat that Paul and Wayne had about Probiotic Breakthrough before it changed its name.
You know, Bioptimizers makes an amazing product called P3OM, which is a prebiotic product. And it's amazing for not only helping repopulate the gut with friendly bacteria, but as Wade will tell you, it's really, really an amazing product in case you ever feel like you're getting any kind of food poisoning or illness coming on. And Wade's right here with me, and he's the co-founder of Bioptimizers, and he knows more about P3OM than anybody. But I can tell you this, I've had nothing but excellent results and nothing but positive feedback from all my clients and friends that I've turned on to P3OM. So Wade, tell us a little bit about P3OM and why it works so well.
Well, P3M is, we call it the Navy SEAL of probiotics.
Amen.
Basically, its job is to kick out the bad guys in your body. Food poisoning is one of those things from bad bacteria. What we've done is we've taken an aggressive strain of L. plantarum. We put it into toxic soup, ran a sine wave to keep a few of them alive. And the few survivors we grow in very specialized medium to make a cultured, patented enzyme that has extraordinary powers. Number one, it survives the intestinal tract.
Yes.
And number two, it is absolutely hunts down pathogens in the body, bacteria, viruses, these type of things. And this is really where the future of probiotics is. It is about developing and culturing and creating super strains of probiotic, very much like the Navy SEALs goes through a training, and these individuals have extraordinary powers to deal with chaos. And in today's world where we want to improve our immunity and our function and our gut health, P3M is head and shoulders above any probiotic out there.
So my understanding is it can be used daily as a supplement, but it can also be used in larger quantities as a defense measure.
We've tested this literally with over 100 of our friends who have been suffering from various times of food poisoning. And a handful of those guys, when you're in food poisoning, and within 20 to 30 minutes, you complete recovery.
That's awesome. And I've seen it happen myself. Angie has felt bad a number of times, and several of people in the house or family have. And I say, take 10. If that doesn't feel good in an hour, take 20. And you've told me you can't overdose on them, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's the beauty of P3M. You can't take too much. They'll fight off the bad guys, and they'll get your digestion rocking and rolling the way it should.
So if you want to have a healthy gut and you want some defense, carry P3OM with you wherever you go, airplanes, cars, business meetings, hotels, conferences, and you've got your Navy SEALs in the bottle, and they're ready for you anytime. Wade, how do we get a hold of your amazing P3OM product?
Super easy. Just go to www.bioptimizers.com/living4D and put in Paul10 for your 10% discount code. That's BIOPTIMIZERS.com/living4D and Paul10 for your discount code.
You got it. There you go. Try it. You'll love it. I use them. I can't tell you enough how much I love this product. I think it's a genius product. And you've heard it right from the master himself. Get your P3OM. Let us know how you feel about it. Lots of love. I think a lot of the difference, too, between the Eastern system and the history of it is that the people that have taught things that we would relate to consciousness and spiritual development historically have been people that were great practitioners of it. But in the West, it's like most topics, professors are people that just have big computers and big memories, and they're really more intellectuals that swap ideas and argue over what Plato said or didn't say, like lawyers. And there's not a lot of depth that I see in them. So it really becomes more like a legalistic type approach. And then it's, okay, what pack do you belong to? And you can see that like with Adlerian psychology and all the different branches of psychology. Mm-hmm. But, like I love that. Are you familiar at all with Kabir?
The poet? For
the
sure.
poet and mystic. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I love Kabir's philosophy. Kabir in his teachings says, look, hiding in caves and meditating isn't a legitimate path to enlightenment. He says, if you want to become enlightened, then get married, you have some kids, have a job, and then see if you can do the work of enlightenment. And so to me, I love Kabir because he's like, let's quit playing games and hiding from reality. You got to get into the world. And if you can't get enlightened there, then you probably aren't doing it right.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Although on the other, I think what happens is most people they don't realize and they just drown in the world. So
yeah.
You have to have a really good, like if you have a really good idea of what practice means,
Yes.
then you can do that.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I think 90% of the people should go to the monastery because they don't have a clue what they're doing.
Yeah, and then that's what's wrong with the Western culture, and that goes right back to what I was saying earlier. The Eastern cultures really came up with legitimately awake teachers that practiced, right? And over here, all you got to do is look around and it's not hard to figure out what's going on. But the good news is people that spend enough time in practice and enough time in study can take the intellectual stuff, test it, and then, take it through an inner alchemy and then bring it out and talk about it in ways and direct people into practices that can become meaningful, which
absolutely.
That's, I think, what you and I both do for a living, really, is that.
Right. That's right.
It's sad that we have to have middlemen between Eastern concepts and Western mindsets, but we really do, because if you don't have that, then you have this, it's kind of like someone built a stone wall between the yin and the yang on the Tai Chi symbol instead of it being a membrane,
Well, you're absolutely right. I think those membranes those hold a lot of secrets.
Yeah.
Because that not only are they membranes in ideas, they're also a membrane in time and space.
Yes,
what I mean by that is the lineage that I'm particularly connected to originates from Gandhara and Alexandria. So Gandhara was a Buddhist kingdom in Afghanistan that was actually a Greek kingdom. So if you can imagine Alexander the Great, right? He invades India, and along that route he sets up city-states. And those city-states are essentially like an integration of Greek culture and then with Buddhist philosophy. And then what happens is the Buddhism slowly goes back to Alexandria itself. So that membrane, the reason I say it's so important is it's a membrane that's also been lost in our history.
Yeah.
And so the idea that there's a problem in like the translation is because that piece of history was kind of nicely removed or hidden because it doesn't really fit into any of the narratives around how we see Western civilization. But if we saw the East and the West as actually being deeply interconnected, it would change a lot of how we kind of see what it is that we're doing.
Yeah. I think another perspective on membranes that's important is that membranes are the transition point between the implicate and the explicate order. If it wasn't for the membranes of your body, you would not be able to explicate your sense of self. You would be just so one with the eternal now. It would be hard to say, I am.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, those boundaries, they're interesting in everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What would sex be without membranes?
The rubbing of two membranes is one of my favorite activities.
Another podcast. John, views on consciousness range quite wildly depending on the core beliefs depending on the core beliefs one holds on issues such as God, the authentic source of nature of humanity, or if their perception is materialist. What are your views on the nature of God? Now, I have three casings of God there, because in Spirit Gem, capital G, capital O, capital D is that for which there is no other, the only being that can create and sustain itself. Capital G, little o, little d in my system is the highest power in any belief system. Little God is any being that can change its environment by choice. So I'm saying, what are your views on the nature of God, God, or God, and materialism or scientific materialism with regard to what consciousness is and how consciousness functions? So, put simply, is I'm saying, do you see that depending on what a person's beliefs on God of God are, or what you would call their imago Dei contents, and their views of consciousness, do you see there's a parallel between first principles for them, or highest source, and how they actually come to perceive consciousness, or even consciousness studies and practices?
So this is a question related to how does your perspective on reality influence how reality expresses itself in your direct experience?
Well, what I'm saying is, let's say if you study Richard Dawkins and ask him what consciousness is.
Let me speak. Yeah. So let me first speak to that.
Yeah.
So without doubt, matter itself has an evolutionary journey.
Sure.
So what I mean by that is that there is a process by which physical evolution is unfolding, and that needs to be taken as one current of evolution. So that's the first thing. So scientific materialism, yes. And those perspectives on evolutionary biology and those are really valuable perspectives. Okay, so that's the first one. Then the second question would be the evolutionary influence of something other than just that, right? Like, so, in my mind, there's an evolutionary influence based on the individual's prior conditioning. We could call that the soul.
Mm-hmm.
And how that soul interacts with with matter,
mm-hmm.
and with the cultural environment, because the evolution is in all four quadrants, if you will. So, so cultural evolution. And so when you're born, you're influenced not only by the stream of matter and where it is, you're also influenced by the cultural context,
mm-hmm.
and then your ability, the degree of intelligence, compassion, and wisdom that you have as a being unto yourself. Okay, so that's kind of three influences. Then there's the influence, if you will, of the logos itself. So I think by logos, so that I would mean the planetary logos. So so in that sense, I see the planet itself as an intelligence residing within a larger field of an intelligence, being a solar system. But if we just start with a planet, so the planet itself, in my kind of understanding, is a multidimensional entity.
Yeah.
For instance, most of the heavens and the hells and the altered, the afterlife experiences are still enfolded within the spectrum of consciousness that is the matter of the planet itself, meaning our planet has subtle bodies and subtle sheaths, just like we do.
Yeah.
And so that planet itself is going through an evolutionary process.
Yes.
Of which humanity is attempting to become part of its noosphere.
Yeah.
So there's also then the influence of that planetary logos, and that would be what we would call, for instance, astrological influences. So when we're talking about like Aquarius and Pisces and those kinds of processes, those are referring to how a planetary logos and its developmental process influence beings enfolded within its evolutionary journey.
Mm-hmm. Very much like the I Ching. influences.
Right. Yeah. You mean in terms of like genetic code and the relationship?
And just how the energy moves through a living system. Just like
Mhm.
Chinese medicine has a 5-element system, alchemy a 4-element system. The I Ching's really, in my view, showing how energy moves through the logos of the planet
Yes.
and produces different physical but also psychological influences because of that change of the flow of energy and information.
Right. So if we pulled back far enough, we would see humanity as an expression of our planetary logos attempting to become an integrated, you know, it's not even yet soul aware. It's like, it's a bit, if our planet was a human being, they're there's a lot going on there in terms of how humanity is an expression of it. So I think that's an influence as well. I think that I'd call that God with a small g.
Yeah.
That's like the demiurge, for want of a better word, but without having a negative spin on it.
Yeah.
And then of course there are like much larger, influences that we are enfolded within. Solar, galactic, and then even beyond that. So
sure, yeah.
There's a lot that influences little Paul and little John right now.
Yeah, it is. In Spirit Gem, I did a map of the soul to show the different levels of the personal and collective unconscious. And I show how they stream into you, and that without an ego to create somewhat of a firewall, you would be so thoroughly dispersed throughout the universe. It would be very, very hard to cultivate awareness that you're doing, learning, being, and growing, because you would just be, it'd be as though if I, how they blow the Michelin Man up, it'd be like if I took John and blew him up so big that we didn't know if his leg was another planet or a star or what it was, kind of like the 7 wise men trying to figure out what the elephant is when they're blindfolded.
Yeah. Well, I think to double click on that, for me, whether we use the ego or the self, whatever terms we want to use for the kind of triune structure of a personality, and by that I mean like kind of mind, emotion, and matter. That itself is a really important part of the sacred and the divine. The idea that higher states are better, I don't quite look at it like that. I look at that actually the most interesting game in town is the individual, right? And then how that is individual is held within these larger states. So I agree with you that the individual self or ego, whatever term you want to give for that, is it's essential to actually a mature understanding of the sacred. The dissolving of the ego is not what we're interested in. We're interested in a degree of integration.
Yes.
Right? And transparency, so that you and I and our listeners can become fully functioning agents for the sacred in the externalization into matter of divinity.
I think that goes right back to your concept of the flowering or the evolution of the soul, its own evolution, its own opening up. I know from working with my soul that my soul is extremely conscious and like vastly more wise and knowledgeable than the thing that I think that I am when I sit here and talk to you. But it's taken me a lot of years of first of all, healing enough to get brave enough to hear the truth that my soul will tell me about me or about life or about anything, right? It takes me, and I think it takes anybody. I think I put it in a metaphor, a lot of people don't really want to know God's opinion on things. There's a funny saying when I was doing some research on God for my book series, someone, I don't remember whose quote it was, but it was really good. It said, "You can always tell who your God is because he hates the same people you do." I'm like, no, that's too typical of people's gods, right? That's one of the reasons I had to make a distinction of what God means when I'm writing about it, so that people don't get confused about, am I just saying hate somebody else,
Sure.
But yeah, all these things are so important, and I think not often enough explored. How do you conceive of the soul and spirit, and how do you feel these relate to consciousness?
It's a great question. I mean, I think the first thing we'd say is one of the personality, soul, and spirit. So the structure, in terms of structures, we're talking about a threefold structure.
Yeah.
If we were to talk metaphor, like kind of cosmological equivalent, we could say the personality relates to the earth, and the soul relates to the sun.
Yeah.
And the spirit relates to like the galactic black hole.
Yeah.
Okay,
Or
so
the electric universe.
yeah, we're talking about, or space itself. So how to put it? So indirect experience, you could say that the attentional system, or what it's called in Sanskrit, the Atman, the attentional system is at the center of the self structure. So the self, and this is self with a small s, it is, it's the ideas, feelings, sensations, beliefs that are glued together by the attention moving around in such a way that it creates the illusion of something that looks solid.
A nexus.
Yeah, nexus. So the self structure or the personality is that level of content. Right. And so what I'm talking about now is like in direct experience of our listeners right now. So the content that you're interpreting, what it is that I'm saying right now, that is your self structure. Now, your soul is the attentional system itself that actually glues that together. So it's the attention that is at the center of the self structure. And that attention, actually, the attentional system itself actually is as unique as the self. What do I mean by that? I mean that some souls, some attentional systems are very sharp and very narrow. A good example would be, on your computer where you have one of those like painting apps, and you can choose whether you want to paint with a thin pen, right, or a paintbrush. Okay. So actually, the soul itself has a structure. It's like, what is it? Is it a thin and pointy? Is it a little bit more like a spray can? So how the soul itself integrates material, that's kind of like at the center of the attentional system. And then spirit itself is the unbounded openness within which all that arises. Now, the feeling tone of that unbounded openness of spirit is of like just vast relief and ease. The feeling tone of that point of the attention is bliss. So the feeling tone of the soul is essentially what they would call in the Tibetan tradition the Sambhogakaya, the bliss body.
Yeah.
And then of course the personality is this body of meat and and brain that we call John and Paul.
And a bunch of other people's ideas.
Right? And so if you look, let's say, in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, there's different forms of alchemy. Obviously, the highest form of alchemy is the fusing of, or the infusion of the soul with spirit, and the infusion of the personality into that soul structure. Now, that's a very high level of alchemy. And in the Indo-Tibetan tradition, when adepts achieve that, that's when rainbow body is accessible.
Right.
In the sense that the degree of putting it another way, the degree to which the soul has used the light of spirit to process the depth of multi-generational trauma. So if you can really get down to the level of atoms and cells, which is a deep, like that, unfortunately to do that, you probably do have to be in a cave, like.
Yeah. Or be very gifted.
Even then, even if you're very gifted, I mean, the busyness of the life, right? And I'm not even saying actually that is what we are here to do. But what I'm saying in terms of like that alchemy of spirit, soul, and personality, when it's like really done at a high level, then essentially the personality gets abstracted into the soul and the soul gets abstracted into spirit.
Which is really what Jung was trying to facilitate through individuation.
Sure.
He was trying to help people bring the gap between the perceptual self or the ego structure into the unconscious or the soul, so that what was previously unconscious was not, just in the back seat and had to control through neurotic episodes because it had no other choice.
That's right.
But so that there was a relationship going on. And having studied Jung for 35 years now, and Steiner and Wilbur and Hazrat Inayat Khan and Ibn al-Arabi and many others, I've found that Jung's definitions and descriptions of the individuation process have helped me guide my own spiritual practice and have an intention for why I do what I do. Like there's a reason I spend time in meditation. There's a reason I do contemplative meditation. There's a reason I practice opening my chakras and breathing through them and seeing through them and, taking responsibility for what kind of shit's hanging out in there and seeing what I can do about it, But I found through my own evolution that the more we work with our unconscious, the less unconscious it is, and the more the vast powers that it has become useful to us. Like I use this all the time, for example, when I'm working with patients and clients that have issues that are so deep they can't even consciously get to them, but I can connect to their soul and talk to their soul, and it tells me, talk to them about what happened between their mother and father when they were in the first trimester in the womb.
Right.
And you will see that there is an influence that they're still carrying because it came into them, et cetera, et cetera. So for most people, the soul is just something that's so absolutely unconscious. It's just kind of a word that people throw around. But once you really, my own experience is as you grow into it and you start realizing what your unconscious was and consciously connect to it. Like some people are very good at card games, and you might ask them, well, how the hell do you know what to do? And they will just say, oh, it's my intuition. But what I'm saying is you can get to know that faculty, and instead of it just being your intuition, it becomes a source of intelligence and consciousness that you can actually have a relationship with that turns out to give you very wise advice about why you shouldn't have done the shit that got you in trouble 10 years ago.
Yeah, I love that, Paul. Thank you.
Hi, guys. What do you reach for when you want a little pickup, when you want a little happy making? There's lots of things that I used to love. For example, I used to love my espresso in the afternoon, but that caused me lots of problems. So I had to retool that one. There's a lot of things that have sugar in them, but my body hates that. If you want to be healthy and you want to be clean, there's not much you can do. But Organifi's got some new happy drops that, believe me, are really good. And they're simple. They've got passion flower, go-to cola, organic saffron, and ginger root extract. And these things are awesome. You put a couple in your mouth. I like to suck them and let them melt down slow. And in a few seconds, you are feeling happy again with a little mood elevation and a little energy lift too. I absolutely love these things. My kids love them. And the thing I love about them is they make me feel good without doing anything but good for me. So if you want to get some happy drops, go ahead and try these. You're going to be amazed. I absolutely love these things, and my kids love them too. And I know you're going to love them. And you don't have to feel guilty about it because there's nothing in there that's bad for you at all. Far better than an addictive anything, and great for you. Try Organifi's Happy Drops.
To try Organifi's new Happy Drops and to get 20% off your order, go to Organifi.com/Chek20 and use the promo code Chek20 at checkout. That's Organifi.com/Chek20. Organifi.com/CHEK20. And the promo code is CHEK20 for a 20% discount.
To just bounce off that, I think that, one of the blessings of, let's say, training in some of these more Eastern systems is they get very technical. So,
Yes.
So for instance, what we call intuition, they call direct, non-conceptual, valid cognition.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is they're saying, listen, that center of consciousness that we're calling the soul, what they would say is its body is universal love, and that body is synchronized with the loving intelligence of the whole universe.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, direct, non-conceptual, valid cognition or intuition, to the extent that a practitioner, and this is where, as you were saying, like the teachers, to the extent that you've actually you have a body of knowledge first, and then you grow into that level of development, because not only is it a state, it's also a trait.
Yeah.
Then this capacity for synchronistic thought comes online.
It does.
And that's what we call intuition. Intuition is synchronicity operating at the mental level. And earlier you asked me about my living philosophy, about the Bodhisattva, so to speak. So this is really what the Bodhisattvic level of development is pointing to, is that you can stabilize the soul as a level of development. When that happens, direct, valid, non-conceptual cognition comes on. Intuition becomes the way that your mind is operating. And what's interesting is, because that loving intelligence is in communication with the loving intelligence of all beings, then synchronicity becomes less of an event that happens, and it more becomes the very fabric of your life, because the larger field of reality wants to wake up with you, and they're like, oh my God, here's an agent, it's Paul, let's wake up with him, and let's provide the circumstances, both in terms of within your own mind and in your life, that are going to help you unfold the path, to itself, by itself. So what you're pointing to in terms of the importance of disembedding from the unconscious, which is what Jung was referring to in terms of individuation, no longer being fused with your mummy and daddy stuff.
Yeah.
And then, the way that the Hindus would say it is, then Maya, or matter as an illusion, becomes Shakti. That once you disembed and you turn around and you start relating to what you were referring to, the instinctual intelligences that you've been given, now they're not running you. Now they're actually able to reveal just dimensions of the sacred that before we weren't aware of.
Yeah, very much so. I think, I used to repair weapon systems on Cobra helicopters, so I have some pretty comprehensive electronics background. But what came to my mind as you were talking, the way I would describe what you're saying, is that the human being is a series parallel processor, and it is the sense of self or the ego structure that is the series, or the intellect's a series processor, but the soul and the intuition is a parallel processor.
Yes.
But what people often don't realize until they get deep enough into themselves, that parallel process extends itself to the infinite. There's nothing going on in God that ultimately, if we do the work to get ourselves out of the way, that we cannot get access to, which is why you can, look at the Hindu scriptures and the ancient scriptures, or read someone like Plotinus, who's the most commonly referenced philosopher of all quantum physicists, because they can't help but shit themselves when they read what Plotinus said, and it matches exactly what they're finding in their research.
Well, and that even weaves into things like remote viewing.
I'm a remote viewer.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. No, I have plenty of it. I actually won a contest in remote viewing in I think the year 2000. That was it was a course, and then it ended with a contest. It was run by the CIA's director of remote viewing at the time.
Was that through the Monroe Institute, or what did they?
No, it was through the Field Conference, run by Lynn McTaggart. And
sure.
Yeah, that year Edgar Mitchell was the keynote speaker, and so they had a one-day remote viewing program, and they took you through the technique, and then they did a series of trials on you, and at the end of the day, there was a contest, and long story made short, I won it. But I didn't use any of their techniques at all, because I found that my own technique was better, which, as an interesting correlate to your story, I began having out-of-body experiences when I was 12, and I thought I was going crazy, so I went out around the farm and I would try to identify things, and the first thing I'd do is get up in the morning and go see if what I saw was there, and it was every time. So later in my life as a therapist, and circumstances came up that I just used that ability. So by the time I got to this remote viewing training program, the way they were doing it to me was too mechanical and too closed off from what my soul does. And really all I do is
that's very different. I mean, because a lot of those techniques were developed by people from the bottom up, meaning like to develop
military
mind, right? Not from like universal love.
Right. I mean, as a side note, my approach to remote, and I've taught a number of my students that reached the point where the problem with remote viewing is if you can't hold your mind still, then you just bounce around like a fucking rubber ball everywhere, and you can't make heads or tails of it. But I had to learn as a kid, because first my spirit body would just float up and out. And then I'm like, well, what do I do now? And then I realized if I held a thought, like, can we go through the wall? I would go through the wall, but I had to hold the intention. If halfway through the wall, I thought I should be back in my body, then I'd be back in my body. So the hard part for people is just learning to calm their mind down, which is why I think various types of meditation are very, very good. But when I remote view, I just simply hold the intention, like I go to the sun or I go all over the place. But if I want to go to the sun, I just go into a meditative state. I get myself real relaxed. It might take 5, 10, 15, even 20 minutes to get to where I can dump the world off my back and just let my mind go flat, like a pond that's so flat it mirrors. And then I just say to my soul, take us to the sun. And I just watch to see what rises in the mirror of my mind. And once I see the image appearing, then I simply leave my body, just like I did when I was a kid, in my astral body, and I step into the sphere of the sun and walk around. But that's very different than what they classically teach in remote viewing.
Sure.
And when I tried doing their approach, it created a lot of mental tension in me. It's like I was like a kid trying to learn how to drive a car for the first time or something. It was like, why go through all this when all you got to do is ask God? The answers are there. And and I'd already come to the realization that the illusion is that we are not the stars, we are not everything else. So once you can get past that, I don't think I'm going to something out there. I just say I'm going to go visit the sun of myself. So just like you might, put your intention to go into your heart, or say, geez, I've got gas pains right now. I just hold the intention to be in my sun, and it happens. And without a long discussion, but my only point is people don't really realize how close they are to never being alone again.
Right. Well, this goes into level. This kind of brings us back to this levels of development.
Yeah.
Because even techniques, you can analyze techniques based on the level of, even like meditation techniques, which is what you're referring to here.
Yeah.
Based on the level of development that actually created that technique.
Right.
Right. And I mean, that's one thing that just in my own work in terms of, let's say, developing meditative systems, a lot of the old techniques were developed from particular limited levels of consciousness. And even though they work, what people don't realize is that they're designed in a certain way by a certain kind of mind. All meditation works. The question is, are you going to get from A to Z by bicycle, by Model T Ford, by Tesla, or by
remote viewing?
Right? So what you're referring, what Paul's referring here to the listeners is different techniques are appropriate at different levels of development. And you can often actually get a sense of where someone's level of development is based upon what techniques they're attracted to, and even and how those techniques work, because behind how those techniques work is an idea about, well, this is how things work.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you don't have any rational impetus to do something.
Right. And what's more interesting is often not the technique, but the kind of thinking and framing behind what developed that technique. Because, for instance, what you're referring to is, in the way that you go about doing it is, well, if the sun is arising within the field of awareness itself, then to even think of the sun as something that's outside of me doesn't make sense. So
right.
In that sense, I just have to relax and recognize that which is that part of me.
Yeah.
That is the sun, if you will, at a deep fundamental level. And that's a much easier way of at least traveling in my mind than thinking that I'm separate from the sun and I'm going to go somewhere.
And I've got to have a bunch of coordinates.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the coordinates can be helpful for certain types of work. But just as a sort of a side note on this, to give you an example, several years ago, maybe 10, 15, maybe 15 years ago, some of my students in Australia, because I have a large student body in Australia, one of the students, there was a big fire there, and one of the students' uncles' properties got burnt to the ground. There was literally nothing left but ash, and they could not find him anywhere. They couldn't find his body. Nobody knew where he was. And after a week or more of everyone in the whole town looking for him, the student got a hold of me and asked if I could try to find him through remote viewing. So I said, well, give me his full name. And then I knew that person's name. So I just said to my soul, please show me where. And I said the uncle's name, who is the uncle of my student, because they're trying to find him and they're scared, and I need your help. If you want me to help this family, then show me where they will find him. And so after I asked my soul, I just went into emptiness, and my massage chair is where I usually do that because it's comfortable. And then I said to my soul, let me know when you have located him. And then my soul said, I have located him. And then I said, okay, please show me where he's at. And then all of a sudden I had like an eagle's view of a farm property, probably 10 acres, quite rectangular. About 2/3 of the way back, there was an irrigation ditch that went directly across the property, and it connected to other farms as well. And what he had done is he had run from the fire, but the fire was so intense that he dove into the irrigation ditch to try to hide. But the fire came right across the irrigation ditch, and it was so hot, it literally cooked him. And when I looked at him and I zoomed in on him, there was nothing but charred bones there.
Oh, no.
So I said, I'm sorry, but he got burnt in the fire. And the reason you haven't seen him is because he's under a bunch of ash. But if you walk about 400 meters straight back behind the house in the ditch, he's left of center in the ditch. And sure enough, they went out and found his skeleton there. I also had 4 of my students get lost in a mountaineering expedition. They got trapped in the snow, and the National Guard and everyone, no one could find them, and they got snowed in. So another friend of mine, one of my higher level students, got a hold of me and said, look, the families of these, they're your students and they're freaking out. But I was able to find them, and sure enough, they found them right where I said they would be. But I just asked my soul, said, show me where these people are at. If you want me to help these people, then I need to direct them. And interestingly, when they found them, I told them they would be under a rock overhang because they got caught by a flash storm, but they froze to death because they couldn't, the snow was like 20 feet deep. And so they were stuck there for days and days on end with just a limited amount of food and water. But when they found them, they had each cut their finger and left a goodbye note to their families in blood, and it was still written in the snow.
It's too bad they didn't get to you earlier.
Yeah, well, yeah, I that would have been helpful because they might have lived, but
Yeah.
But they, you know what? One of them said, "Please don't worry about us. We died doing what we love to do." And I think that was quite a conscious thing for that particular student to say, because I think it took a lot of the sting out for the parents. I mean, you can't ever get over something like that. But I know because my brother committed suicide when I was 35, and it took me a long time to kind of process that. Hello, my fellow spiritual warriors and world workers. I hope you're enjoying this podcast as much as I am. It is no secret that today we are not only bombarded with so-called health and fitness information from every angle, be it social media, TV, podcasts, etc., but clearly it's not working. Many studies conducted worldwide show that children, teens, adults, and the elderly are the most unhealthy, overweight, and the sickest they've ever been. But it does not have to be that way for you. When I wrote my book, How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy, I researched the number of diet books available at that time, and there were over 5,000 of them, each claiming to have the right diet for anyone and everyone. But the reason I wrote How to Eat, Move, and Be Healthy was because these books all overlook the fact that no two people are the same, and therefore no two people are likely to get good results on the same diet. That's simply fact. Another reason the myriad of diet approaches available today fail so often is that they don't look at the underlying causes that lead to body health and mental emotional challenges. They treat the human being as though it were a machine, and all you need to do is add this liquid or that supplement, and presto, the machine runs again. These issues are more important than ever considering the physiological, mental, emotional, environmental stress and toxicity in the world today. Today, it is critical to learn the essentials of how to eat, hydrate, breathe, cultivate life force energy, and use your mind to create the life you've always wanted to live. This is exactly what you will learn in our upcoming Holistic Lifestyle Coach Level 1 training program, live with my wife and master instructor, Angie Chek. This workshop is designed for anyone that genuinely wants to be healthy and is ideal for fitness enthusiasts, athletes, and parents. It's also a great chance to explore and see if you want to move into our Holistic Lifestyle Coach Level 2, which is our professional level training, and pursue a career as a holistic lifestyle coach today when it is so desperately needed. Not only will you be taught by Angie Chek, one of the most knowledgeable experts in holistic health in the world, I will make guest appearances and answer questions. HLC1 is a rare opportunity to take HLC1 training live at our beautiful Rainbow home, atop of a mountain in Fallbrook, California, with beautiful views, and you get to enjoy my amazing stone-charged water and work out in my beautiful gym. So if you want to learn from a true master in person and get your most important questions answered, don't miss this special opportunity. If you want to meet other holistically minded people and grow your conscious community, there's no better place than our live workshops. In this important, practical 3-day training program, you will learn how to apply the 1, 2, 3, 4 approach to developing long-term body-mind changes and how to apply the 5 essential program design factors. Learn to use your Chek nutrition and lifestyle questionnaires for assessing physiological load and making essential diet and lifestyle changes. Understand the relationship between the 6 Chek foundation principles and body-mind stress. Learn how to apply the 6 Chek foundation principles to balance your body systems so you can exemplify well-being. Identify common roadblocks to success with diet and lifestyle modifications and gain simple solutions. Discover how to use the less is more principle of exercise prescription. To learn more and register, go to chekinstitute.com/core. That's chekinstitute.com/core. I'm sure this will be a life-changing workshop for anybody that attends, and I look forward to seeing you all here at our beautiful home in Fallbrook, California. Enjoy.
HLC1 with Angie Chek will be held on May 30th to June 1st, 2025. To learn more and to register, go to chekinstitute.com/core. That's chekinstitute.com/CORE. Don't miss this only opportunity to take HLC1 live and in person with Angie this year.
John, I'm enjoying our dialogue a lot. This next question is one that there's a lot of debate about in philosophical circles and many others. I'm sure you're familiar with it. When it comes to God consciousness, there are many that believe though human consciousness evolves, God's consciousness does not, just as some people believe that God is entirely outside of its creation, like God created the universe and wound it up like a clock and then is not involved anymore. Others believe that because there can be no separation between God and anything else, that the evolution of any being or human being within God is inherently God's evolution as well. What are your thoughts in this regard?
I have none. I plead the fifth.
That's so funny. That's hilarious.
Having said that,
the other part of you has something to say?
having said that, so it kind of depends on you can look at it also from the perspective of practice.
Yeah.
So the types of mysticism, for instance.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's one perspective where in alchemy, you would say that the spirit is the complete refinement of something.
Uh-huh.
So in that sense, when we would use the term God, we're referring to that which is most refined.
Yeah.
And as such, when you're referring to that which is most refined is not within the bodies, if you will, of creation. It is the complete essence. Mm-hmm. This is the same kind of, so if you put that into practice, if you do a contemplative practice where you essentially refine or you basically say no to everything, you eventually get to the essence. However, that is only one definition of the sacred. The other definition is that the sacred includes the fact that essence permeates through everything. And the only reason you had to remove everything was so that you could recognize its fundamental nature everywhere and all at once. So if you have a non-dual point of view, God is everywhere, saturated within everything.
Right.
If you have a perspective of, I want to experience pure God or pure consciousness, removed from all of the God's expressions and God's tissues, then you're going to take the idea that God is somehow removed.
Yes. Yeah,
they're both true. They're both true practically. One is kind of they're both alchemical processes, actually. The danger of the first one, the danger of the abstraction, is that if that becomes theology, that's a very dangerous theology. Because essentially it ends up being highly dualistic and ends up with the situation that we have, that matter and spirit are completely separated.
Right. Exactly. And that's how you get materialism.
That's how you end up with materialism. So if you, in essence, of course, what we're talking about is a spectrum of color.
Yeah.
On one end, you could say you have white, and on the other end, you have red.
Or black.
Or black, right? And of course, if it's a spectrum, well, then it just bleeds all the way through. But if you're interested in the absolute ends of the spectrum, well, then you're going to have husk, like the husk of God, which is like the crust, matter, and on the other end, pure spirit. But like that makes for a very uninteresting theology, B, very uninteresting life, and really bad sex. So
yeah, and with a lot of guilt. And probably shame.
That's right.
Which
Exactly.
I spend most of my life helping people heal from.
So yeah, my view is that they're both ways that you can view spirit. There's even more ways that you could view spirit other than just those two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was a very good answer for a non-answer. I'm impressed. You're a Buddhist and a thinker at the same time.
Is that unusual?
Well, not amongst the right circles of people, and thank God for that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't actually think of myself as a Buddhist. Yeah, I tend to have problems with people who are card-carrying members of anything.
Yeah. I don't know who said it. Was it Woody Allen that said?
Probably.
I won't. I would never join any group that would accept me.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's great. Yeah, I'm sort of like, I don't do well in group think tanks because I think for myself, and that inevitably disrupts belief systems and leads to problems.
Well, I think you mentioned that obviously developmentally we're clearly at a point in time and space where we can see that our planet is a single planet.
Totally.
And if you understand that, then you would understand that all of if we understand that, we'd understand that all the various explorations of human consciousness are various approaches from the same place.
Yeah.
And so, we don't yet have a planetary tradition or a planetary dharma, but we will. And to say that tradition would be Buddhist or, I don't know, psychology or any number of these things simply wouldn't be true, because really it would be planetary. So that's kind of where, in terms of the roots of the tradition, that I am it's not Buddhist, it's not anything. This is human spiritual truth, just like trees and grass and water and sky. The water in New Mexico and the water in India and the water in the Himalaya, I mean, at the end of the day, it's still water.
They're all wet.
It's all wet. Yeah.
Now, there's many models of the structure stages of consciousness available. Ken Wilber, Gene Gebser, and Arthur Young are the three that I use the most and have studied the most. In Dustin DePerna's book, Streams of Wisdom, there's a fantastic overview of structure stages of consciousness. Is there a model that you rely on most, and if so, why?
Which is probably about 20 or 30.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not, I'll have to write at some point. Yeah, look, so I like Wilbur. I think his calibrations are off. I like the Jane Lovinger, Suzanne Cook-Reuter, Terry O'Fallon stream of ego development. Michael Commons is the cognitive complexity. Claire Graves, spiral dynamics. I mean, I think it's like these are all different perspectives on looking at something that is none of them. And the more of these that you have, the more the hologram that is what it is that truly is there objectively reveals itself.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. It's a great perspective. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, I use mine, and I haven't written it down. So there you go. Jeez.
Yeah, what I do is I take what I learn and then I observe life and people and myself, and I say, does this structure fit? Does this technique work? Who does it work for? Who doesn't it work for? And that's how I've done everything I built my entire institute that way. But I always go through the testing phase and get it to the point where I've tested it enough with enough people that I can draw some fairly reliable conclusions. And, as I wrote in my outline to you, one of the things that I've always found challenging is that a lot of the Ken Wilber types, they're so rigid on these borders and barriers and structures, and it's like you always get put into some pigeonhole. And and I'm certainly amongst Ken Wilber's followers, there's a wide variety. I've interviewed Keith Witt multiple times, and I think he's a genius of a guy. I really love having my dialogues with him, and he's like you. He's got a whole huge, massive toolbox of experience to draw from. And Gebser warned in his teachings, Ever-Present Origin, predominantly, that you can't use a linear model for the evolution of consciousness. And it's very much the same because I teach infant development, and I studied infant development and went to the Czech Republic and worked there with some of the most experienced explorers of infant development. But one of the things you learn in infant development is even though there's a set of structures stages that a child goes through, a lot of them skip stages. But when you go back and review and use things like video analysis or closer scrutiny, some of these kids are just so athletic that they mix stages together and cross a stage without actually having to do something that looks exactly like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
And
absolutely. I think that it's like the difference between anatomy and physiology, maybe. Like,
yeah,
once, anatomy, like, obviously, is the study of anatomy is from dead
yeah.
So with the psyche, there's something useful about being able to like pull apart all the different stages and levels of development, and of course, even let's say if we're using a multiple tradition, bodies or sheaths or energies and blah 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 blah. Okay, so you have chakras, sheaths, levels of development. These are all the structures. Okay. However, physiology and the process by which a soul evolves through those structures is first it's pretty unique, based on typology and trauma and environmental influences and the soul and all of these things. So you've got a bunch of factors that make the kind of the physiology of that individual highly unique.
Yeah.
Right. And the structures help you kind of get a sense of like where they're at and what the lessons might be.
Yeah.
But I don't believe, well, when you teach something, it's useful to teach it in a linear way. And what I mean by that is, if I'm teaching meditative development or ego development, it makes sense to go step by step by step by step by step. But that isn't the same thing as when you leave the person alone, how their system is going to metabolize what it is that you've taught them is going to be, a bit of shadow work and then a bit of like this and a bit of it's a dynamic, individual, like beautiful process.
Yeah, I think I know how you'll respond to this, but I know I've noticed that there's a correlation between a person's values on key things and where they're at in their conscious evolution. Have you, for example, if you ask a person, what do you think God is?
Mhm.
And does your God have rules and regulations? And is it only accepting of certain people? I'm asking them a values question, but it tells me a lot about where they're at in their evolution of consciousness. So my question was simply, do you see a correlation between what we would classically call structure stages and the parallel values that a person holds on to?
Yes. Until they learn that, and then they fuck with it.
Yes, that's the problem with the intellect.
That's right.
And in the Western world, it's all about climbing the ladder, right?
The moment somebody knows that that's the case, then I'm like, then I wouldn't use that as the way of, because what happens is the mind can then begin to like, oh, this is what the next stage ahead might look like.
Yeah.
And so the danger is actually the mind can build a simulacrum of that stage of development.
But then when it's time to face an issue like a pandemic, you find out that simulacrum is often not very stable, and they fall down to the only thing that has any solidity, which is usually in their unconscious.
Yeah, you see, the way that the models that I use is really based on to say it's Buddhist it's not quite true, but essentially the first thing is for me, the mind and consciousness isn't separated from the heart.
No.
And so I see all levels of development when it's authentic. And by authentic, I mean, well,
it's lived.
Well, okay. You could look, a lot of things evolve. Cancer evolves, assholes evolve. Okay. Just because something is like level 5 doesn't actually mean it could be a level 5 asshole.
Yeah.
So the first thing is evolution of processes and its complexity doesn't tell me if actually that is it living or is it AI? Like
yeah.
If it's living, for me, it means that it's unfolded from the heart and that the higher stages of development have come online because the person has wanted to serve in deeper ways, and therefore realize their limitations and therefore develop more complexity from a place of compassion. So I look at levels of development as expressions of compassion, meaning the more concerned you are about the world, the more actually you are going to evolve complexity, because you're going to realize that you have to work out how to help. And of course, as you do that, you're going to evolve.
Yep.
But those stages can look very similar and not come from the same motivation. So the motivational factor, Paul, like, why am I going on this journey and why am I learning these things? These matter a big, for me, that they tell me a lot about actually where is this growth coming from?
Yeah.
Or is it the brain? And when this person dies, they think that they're an integral, but they're just going to have an integral rotted brain. And actually, the soul itself hasn't really evolved much because the soul only thought that perspective taking was cognitive and didn't take it deep into their heart.
Yeah, it's kind of like the syndrome of people that go to weekend workshops and have all piles of certificates on the wall, but you don't see any evidence of it in their relationships to themselves or in their spousal relationships. I tell my students, the only thing you can take with you when you die is what you've become. So anything else is less important than Steiner says. The first thing that happens when you die is you find yourself surrounded by people just like you, and you stay with them until you're absolutely sure of what you'll never do again. I think that's hilarious. There's some deep truth to that. Well, what I'd love it if you could do is just maybe take the listeners through whatever your own model is of how you see consciousness evolving. For example, what would be the gestalt that you might use if you were in counseling with someone, they came in and you're trying to figure out, okay, this is what their challenge is, this is where they're at, this is where if I can get them, support them in their evolution to this, then these kinds of challenges they're dealing with now won't be likely to keep reinventing themselves in their life because they'll have a bigger view.
Right. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. A couple of things just popped up even before, like,
Yeah, sure.
which is, I think that, and I'm sure you're going to agree with me on this, one of the challenges of that, and one of the challenges of even a normal healthy person coming in to work with us, is that because they're a child of this culture and civilization, so if we start with a premise, which I think that you were pointing to, that the sacred is not black and white.
No.
It's all the colors.
Yeah.
Right. And so the model, of course, is the old black and white model. Okay, so if we are the premise that all the colors are sacred, the truth is most people that come into our offices, even if they're healthy and they're beginning the journey, actually they've inherited, let's say, color 1, 2, and 3 are offline. And even if they're beginning the journey, they have problems with the prior levels of development that actually they're not being seen as sacred, and therefore, and I see this a lot, let's say in integral world would be one of them, that if the person has not been introduced to sacred world, and by that I mean that and this is what medicine work does in indigenous traditions.
Yeah.
So, my indigenous roots are in the kind of Druidic tradition, if you will. So if you're not introduced to the sacred world, so that means that you're not introduced but to the cultural level of the sacred. So this is Paul, John, the ground and the stones are sacred, right? And of course that's then backed up by science, like sacred Western science. So we lost our sacred science.
Yep.
Our alchemy, most people aren't aware that Newton, for instance, 90% of his writings were on alchemy.
Right.
So let's say you and I, or the student comes in and they come at a postmodern level of development. There's no sacred modernity. Sacred modernity is sacred science.
Right.
There's no sacred indigenous sense of...
Right.
Okay, so that's already a big fucking problem.
Mm-hmm.
Even before they begin the journey, because there's stuff that we have to go back and we have to learn.
Mm-hmm.
That our bodies are sacred and the trees are sacred and plants. And okay, so I guess I'm saying that because what I've seen in the majority of people that, let's say, are interested in, let's say, ego development and the higher stages of development, they tend to look at that as psychology.
Yeah.
And I think at this point, psychology is dangerous.
I understand. Yeah.
What I mean by that is let's say, most of those Wilberians or any of those like higher stages of ego development, the tendency is to think of that as a psychology and not necessarily as objective dimensions that exist in the outside world.
Right. Yeah.
And 99% of the time, that's what I see, which means that any of the descriptors for anything above postmodern, integral, and then above actually have a huge blind spot.
Yeah.
So the model I tend to use, I call it the chromatic intelligence model or harmonic model.
Mm-hmm.
If you think of like harmonics in music,
Yes.
right? So let's say we have a model, let's say that like Wilbur's, like 12 distinct fulcrums of development, right?
Yeah.
However, what I would say in each of those fulcrums is actually seven dimensions. And the reason this is important is you can open up the highest in one of the dimensions. So you can strike note C, and C will resonate all the way up. And the tendency is, because of our naivety in our culture, to think, oh, this person has realized supermind
Yeah.
or overmind.
Yeah.
But actually, all they're playing is one note
Yeah.
of that dimension. So the first thing is before we even talk about like those stages, the question is the fullness of each of those stages, right? So that we don't end up, as we go higher, becoming more and more fucking anemic, right? And more and more, so in some ways I'm even like reluctant to even talk about those higher stages, because what I've seen is a bunch of people who think they have attained those stages and maybe have attained them based on an anemic definition of what they are.
Yeah.
The reason, I'll give you an example, the reason this becomes super important is, let's say you have a good, let's say, shamanic capacity. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to take a bunch of medicines. It just means also that you recognize that you're living within a sacred world or a sacred cosmology. So in that,
And you're open to communication to and from it.
well, for sure, right? But that's at the narrative level. So the narrative level, I mean, do we talk spiral dynamics here? I mean,
You can. You just need to explain it, because with the amount of listeners we have worldwide, there'll be many people that won't have a clue what that is.
okay, well, let me put it this way. So at a narrative level of development, so what do I mean by that? I mean the level of development where you articulate to yourself what the structures of who you are and what the universe is, right?
Your own story.
Your own story, and also your own cosmology.
Yeah.
So if your cosmology doesn't include the sacred dimensions of this realm and the next realm and your ancestors, and all of that is happening right here, right now, and doesn't include some way that you might be interacting with them, even if you're like clueless about it.
Right.
If you don't have that as a cosmology, when you go up these higher stages of development, those higher stages will look weird. Okay, so that being said,
what you're saying is we don't want to produce enlightened chemists that are still spraying Roundup all over their backyard.
Yes, and I see that. Well, if we go back to what you were referring to with what happened in the pandemic, you could see a lot of that, because people's intuitive capacity to understand the nature of evil, and this is an important piece around this, is if you don't really understand the sacred, you don't really appreciate the shadow all the way up.
Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So what that means is that
the dark side of righteousness.
Well, the dark side extends deeply into those other dimensions, and to the extent that you're naive about that cosmology, or you think it's just psychological, then you are naive to what it is that we're here to do, and what are the challenges that we're facing,
and who we are, and what we are.
Yeah, because there are people on this planet who would happily turn you and me and the listeners into dog food.
Oh yeah,
right.
Bill Gates.
Good old Billy, right? So I'm saying all that because we have to think of this as this is where I differ from Ken's models, is I really see the developmental process as like a deepening participation in sacred world, and not just in higher stages of cognition and of perception.
Yeah, I think that's the Druid coming out of you.
Yeah, that's right. So I don't. Okay, so what might this look like developmentally? Well, clearly, we begin a journey as a child,
Yeah.
and if we had that journey and it went the right way, in some ways, the first level of the sacred we would be introduced to would be the body itself, right? So our parents would make us feel so loved and cherished within our body and so attuned and safe that our experience of embodiment would be like that this is just really, really, really good. And of course, the parents can't do that unless the society can provide that. So, our society doesn't provide that. So already there's a degree of lack of safety and security that we all carry by virtue of being on a planet at war.
Yeah.
So, okay, so, then as we would evolve, let's say, we would be introduced to the imaginal dimension. So the sacred, the astral, the sacred for the child is when the child kind of awakens into the astral. Well, in fact, they are in the astral.
They are, yeah.
Right? So to the extent that mom and dad can keep that astral alive.
Very important. It's
Right?
so beat out of kids so early. It's
So beat out of kids, right? It's
that's why Osho said children are born God and the parents beat it out of them.
It's terrible. It's terrible.
I know, but it's terribly true.
No, it's true. It's true. Okay, so to the extent that imaginal is, so let's imagine that that's then kept alive. Okay,
Yes.
kept alive. Okay, so then, as the child individual develops, they begin to develop like second person perspective, where they begin to see, oh my gosh, there's Paul, and Paul has his own perspectives. Right? And that level of development is what Piaget would call rule role. Like it's kind of like, it's a very binary level of development. Like, I'm a good boy if I do this, and I'm a bad boy if I do that, right?
Right, yeah.
Now, of course, imagine the difference if you're raised in like an indigenous Druidic culture where you have that level of development versus being that level of development in secular America or with fundamentalist Christian parents. Right? It's like we're comparing what it would be like to raise a child in Wakanda versus raising a child in America right now.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I think I just want to try and get a sense of what optimal might look like, and then where most of us are kind of the environment struggling because we're growing inside of challenging environment. So third person perspective. So I'm kind of taking a perspectival journey, right? Third person perspectives is where we can begin to. There's Paul, there's John, but there's also something objective that we can agree about. So all of our listeners here, if we were to all do an experiment where we looked at something objectively, like we can all look at something over there and say, how far away from us is the moon, or how far away from Paul is John, or how far is John from Paul? These are objective things that can be measured.
Yeah.
Right? And it's out of that mind that the whole scientific method arose.
Sure.
Now, imagine if you haven't. So imagine if your view of the sacred is black and white. Okay, so once you get to third person at black and white, there's no longer any sacred because now it's about objectivity. On the other hand, if you're in sacred science and you're working with, let's say, this idea of the sacred being color, then you're being able to start investigating how the sacred expresses itself in matter. So this is where science splits. And this is what I was saying about levels of development aren't necessarily an expression of the evolution of sanity. They can be expressions of the evolution of insanity.
Yeah, we've got plenty of that going on.
So third person science black and white science would be our good friend Fauci, and right where
Yuval Noah Harari.
yeah, that's right. Although he might even be fourth person, but we can get there.
Yeah.
But sacred science would be, all the alchemists. So imagine if you went to MIT or Harvard or wherever you went to, and you learnt about extracting, the essence from minerals and plants, and how you could use those because they were states of consciousness, right? So there's a whole body of medicine, let's say, Ayurvedic medicine, homeopathic medicine, vibrational medicine.
Anthroposophic.
It's all based on third-person perspective, but because they didn't lose the sacred and sacred world, if one of our listeners grew up seeing the sacred in nature and seeing, and being encouraged by their parents to see the auras around plants, by the time they got to study biology, they would know that there was something more there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So we have lost, the important thing is we've lost the sacred at first and second and third person perspective. That's already gone for most people. I mean, it sounds like, you were lucky, Paul, in that, you had experiences early on that informed you developmentally. So by the time you got to third person perspective, you were already like, where's the science of consciousness? Because I had out of body experiences as a kid. Don't tell me it doesn't exist.
If you have listened to even one episode of Paul's podcast before, then you will know that he is passionate, and some would say even fanatical, about the quality of the food he eats and where it is sourced from. That is why the Chek household only eats pasture-raised meat, wild-caught fish, and organic produce. And that is why we subscribe to Wild Pastures meat delivery service. Each month, Wild Pastures delivers a box of meat that has been raised by family farmers in the USA using regenerative farming practices. 100% grass-fed and finished beef, pasture-raised chicken, and pasture-raised pork, as well as wild-caught seafood. You can customize the selection in your box, add on extra when you know you will be feeding more people, or change your options each and every month. You might be thinking that this will be too expensive for you, but Wild Pasture's mission is to offer the highest quality meat at the lowest prices because they want to transform the meat industry. And that means that more people need to be able to choose meat that is raised right. Their pasture-raised animals are part of a natural ecosystem. Their farmers use rotational grazing, practices that mimic nature, and so do not need to use synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, hormones, or antibiotics. This beautiful process doesn't require the external resources, such as massive amounts of GMO grain, required with environmentally depleting conventional methods. And best of all, the meat and fish taste amazing. And for Paul's listeners, Wild Pastures are offering you 20% off your subscription for life, $15 off your first order, and free shipping. Seriously, you can't find a better deal for top quality pasture-raised meat. Go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek. You don't need a promo code. Just visit wildpastures.com/Paul Chek and start choosing the goodies you will have delivered to you in your first box.
Well, I got saved because my mother was a Christian Scientist, but then she became a yogi when I was 12, and she joined the Self-Realization Fellowship Temple, which is Yogananda's teachings. And then when I was 15, I went to summer camp with the monks. So I got the benefits of going to the weekly temple meetings and meditating with monks, hearing their sermons or lectures, and learning meditation techniques. But then when I got to spend the summer with them, I really got to pick up their vibration and noticed how they looked me in the eyes when they talked to me, and they answered every question I could throw at them without any hesitation, resistance, or any of the crap that you would get in a Christian church where you just told children are meant to be listen, not talk.
Right.
And that kind of crap. So, and my parents had quite a violent relationship, but once my mother somehow talked my stepfather into going to temple, and he started meditating. So there was about a year there while he was going to these temple meetings and meditating, that there was like the most stable period in my childhood. But once he fell off the wagon and got back into his old habits, and it was, living in hell. So I had a yogi mother and a rodeo rider ass kicker father. And then I think the blessing for me is that there was enough stress in the family and in the environment all the time that when I could go in my room and close the door and just shut my mind off, I had a way of detaching from that. And that kind of stuck with me for my whole life. And I think I couldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you if it wasn't for the fact that my mom made that transition and ultimately went to India 3 times for different initiations and became a world-class sculptor. I wish I could show you my mother's sculpture. She's in museums all over the world, but she specializes in people that devoted their life to keeping peace. And so, I kind of had this crazy upbringing where my mother was deeply spiritual, but my father was,
Yeah.
spare the rod and spoil the child. And there was no sparing the rod.
Yeah, hence the paradox that is Paul Chek.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Working on Cobra helicopters and whatever else.
Yeah. I had to kind of see what made me feel uncomfortable before I got brave enough to say I can't participate in that.
Right.
But there's a great example, because without Yogananda's teachings and the imprint of the monks, I might have just been a career elite soldier, because I wouldn't have had the empathy and compassion to, for example, what got me out of the military is the fact that I could not ask if the persons we were going to go kill were actually guilty of something that was a real threat to our nation. And the heart in me said, I can't kill just to kill because some rich guy wants me to go take someone's oil.
Right. Well,
there's a good example of exactly what you're saying, right?
Well, I would have loved to have joined the military. Like, I have a bunch of military ancestors, but because I grew up around the elite people in power, I knew what assholes they were. And I'm like, well, there's no way I'm going to do what these people say.
Yeah.
Anyway, going back to the story, let me just go back to the story. So if we think of this about love unfolding, so if the first thing that love unfolds is it embraces the body and it embraces the emotion, right?
Yeah.
And then that's first person. And then as we begin to develop the sense of second person, if love unfolds right, it begins to develop in such a way that we have a sense of love and compassion for the other.
Yeah.
And when it gets to third person, we begin to get a love, but the love now is an intellectual, like we want to understand, like, what is the objective nature of love, of the sacred? Okay, so that's where we get all the sacred sciences, from sacred mathematics, sacred geometry, pyramids, math, that whole dimension of the sacred that you see, let's say, in the traditional Western esoteric traditions. That's where that would come in, is that third person. Okay, now what happens, and if it doesn't come in, then you get third person, the unsacred, which is your rats and stats. Okay, now as consciousness evolves to fourth person, what happens at fourth person is able to take a perspective on third person, right? So it's able to see the limited nature of the third person perspective, and fourth person becomes interested in the context that the perspective is the context with which the third person is happening from. Like, what you call objective, Paul Chek, is different from what maybe an Aboriginal would call objective, or somebody who's well versed in I Ching science in China might call objective, right? So fourth person perspective recognizes and it sees the cultural context as being relative.
It sees the whole rainbow.
It sees the rainbow. And so fourth person perspective is your super relativistic level of consciousness, because it's able to see, hang on a second, we're all relative here. You have your truth, Paul. John has his truth. And all the listeners out there, they have their own truths. And you can pick and choose what you like. That's your relativistic level of consciousness. And its dimension of the sacred is to invite all of those who have not been invited to the table. So let's hear from the Native Americans. Let's hear from the Native Indian. Let's hear from everybody, right? Mm-hmm. So this is where diversity and inclusion as a level of consciousness develops. Now, there is a sacred way of doing that, and there's a way of doing that where you're just like, well, that's what we're going to do, and we're kind of like, if rats and stats is at third person, then at fourth person you get some weird kind of
textbook.
Yeah, and that's when, let's say, race becomes actually a thing that is then used to manipulate language, and it becomes highly limited.
Yeah.
So there's a sacred version, and there's a black and white version.
Mm-hmm.
So in the sacred version, this is where also at fourth person, we recognize that we've gone through first, second, third, fourth. We've gone on this journey. And so at fourth person, we recognize the sacredness of our body, the sacredness of our emotions, the sacredness of our mind, the sacredness of each other.
Love.
And you're really beginning to intuit the sacredness at a more planetary, everybody is my brother and my sister.
Mm-hmm.
It is the level of the sacredness of the great hoop, the great circle of all beings, right?
Yeah.
No matter what level of development, if you're a human and you respect life and you come to my circle, Paul, you're going to be part of that great hoop.
Yeah.
Right. And that is a very powerful level of development, because it really helps us all see each other as brothers and sisters.
Kind of reminds me of the beginning of Claire Graves' second tier, yellow and turquoise, moving up from there.
Yeah, so Claire Graves, at this point, we're at green. Yeah. At this point.
Okay, so you're calling this green. Okay.
Yeah, this is green, because fourth person perspective isn't able to think yet hierarchically.
Okay, yeah, that's the qualifier that I was looking for.
Yeah. So this is the circle, and everyone's equal, and diversity. Everyone's perspective is equal.
Ken Wilber's new book, Radical Wholeness, gives a very good tour of the dark side of green.
Yeah, I mean, there's an important part of diversity and inclusion, and there's, when I did my PsyD in clinical psychology, it was almost like I couldn't speak because I was a white older man in the class. Like it was the cultural context was like, if you're a minority and if you're a woman and if you were queer in some way, that you and that, don't get me wrong, it's really important that those voices were brought in. But the other side of it was that actually the tendency to push out voices that also should be part of the conversation.
Yeah, and potentially have even more depth of experience.
Yeah, exactly. So okay, 4.5. So as you begin to realize, so the thing about this postmodern level of development, it doesn't think hierarchically. So it might be interested in spirituality, but in terms of, let's say, organizing their life in a hierarchical way, they're not very good at that, which means, I don't know, like preparing for, spiritual practice and going and eating fast food, it's all the same. I mean, it's difficult for them to differentiate between a hierarchy of values.
Yeah, I don't know, I might be stabbing in the dark, but it seems like there might be a difficulty differentiating the sacred and the profane.
Well, in some ways, that's
meaning if you greenwash everything, you lose sight of
there's a good part of that and a bad part of that. The good part of that is they'll be like, hey man, like embrace your body and your feelings. And the bad part of that is, well, my feelings are sacred, and therefore if I'm a raging narcissist, then it means that that's also the sacred.
Yeah. Right? That's kind of what I was pointing at, and I'm glad that you didn't misunderstand what I was trying to say.
Yeah. So on our journey, let's say in an ideal environment, we would have done first person crawling around on our hands and knees. Second person, we would have got up on our, walking around. By the time we hit third person, we're like 10 to 10, 11, 12. We're beginning to think rationally, and ideally you'd hit fourth person perspective given the right environment by high school, because really what you're doing there is you're learning to think about thinking. So you're learning to think about different ways of thinking. And so fourth person perspective is like, well, you can think of it this way, you can think of it that way, you can think of it this way or this way, but they're still very relativistic, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then at some point you begin to realize that nature is hierarchical or hierarchical, that the things unfold.
Yeah.
And you begin to realize that there are levels of development, if you will, even beyond the mind itself.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So fifth person perspective begins to realize that you can make thought itself an object. And as such, you can begin to experience awareness abstracted from any kind of thought process.
Mm-hmm. Steiner has a lot of exercises to bring that quality into people.
Right? Okay, so a lot of the contemplative traditions are doing that. And in the beginning, that is a state, and that's really stabilized into a trait.
Mm-hmm.
So mature fifth person perspective is a kind of mature person who has maybe, a constant degree of recognition of the fundamental openness of experience, whilst they're able to use their mind in an active way, right? So that process itself, we're talking probably a 10-year journey from, altered states to traits.
I want to just share what I'm perceiving here to make sure that I'm following you, and it might help listeners. At the fifth level or fifth person perspective you've just described, somebody at that level might be able to say to somebody at the fourth person level, well, I understand what you're saying, but that's the wrong type of thinking or perspective to effectively address the issue that we're trying to resolve here.
Yeah, and then you get punched probably, but that's...
You might, but that's really the issue, right? It's almost like the descriptions of, if you're a two-dimensional being, you never think to look up. Right. And so you don't really realize there's this thing called depth, so you don't look for the lights on the ceiling because there's no conception of it. But somebody at fifth person is like the ceiling above the floor of the fourth person perspective.
That's right. Okay. So to put this in another way, if the person is still embedded in sacred, so this is the difference between somebody, so you could learn to do that as a psychological exercise.
Mm-hmm.
And you could gain fifth person perspective. However, let's say you weren't embedded in sacred world. So what that means is you didn't understand that the world is sacred, that there are the sacred dimensions of the plants and the animals and the ancestors. So if you're not living in that world, then when you access fifth person perspective, it's going to just be like a kind of anemic.
It'll be a more evolved algorithm.
Yes.
An AI type approach.
Right. Exactly. However, if you're embedded in sacred world, and the main way that that the heart is still online, at fifth person perspective, you begin to participate in what we would call hierarchy. So what we would mean by hierarchy there would be that you begin to wake up to the fact that there is a organization, for want of a better word, of like planetary bodhisattvas who are committed to the transformation of this planet. Because at that level, you begin to wake up, not only your intuition wakes, because the heart can communicate through time and space and beyond the dimensions, you begin to wake, if the calibration has been accurate, you begin to wake up to your participation in sacred world in a much more defined way. So this is where really the path of the Bodhisattva begins, because to the extent that you realize that then, let's say the civilization that you and I come from, Paul, and some of our listeners come from, it already exists enfolded within the subtle dimensions of the planet. Mm-hmm. We're not trying to get back there. We're trying to birth that into reality, into physical. We're trying to rebirth, if you will.
Yeah.
Sacred hierarchy, and and I know if you're a fourth person perspective, you would have just thrown up when I said the word hierarchy, because you have an allergy to that word.
Yes.
But essentially, what hierarchy means, hieros archos, would mean like sacred order, sacred structure.
Or like I like the way Ken Wilber puts it, growth hierarchies versus power and domineering or control hierarchies.
Yeah, although I don't even like the term growth, because that could be like stubble hierarchies. I think hierarchies of loving wisdom,
mm-hmm.
right? Like growth in loving wisdom.
Sure.
Right. So a fifth person perspective, you are beginning to, if you're not a fifth person narcissist, which can happen. So this is why stages aren't necessarily good unto themselves. If you are connected to the sacred world, you begin to then engage in, you begin to recognize and see sacred world, because you now have a capacity to see beyond dimensions and through dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a capacity to see what needs to happen on this planet, because you are willing to organize yourself hierarchically, you're also attuning to the hierarchical structure of our planet and those great mature sages who kind of are the elders who are like, this is where we're headed.
Mm-hmm.
So that begins at fifth person perspective, and it really matures at sixth person perspective, where you begin to realize that you are engaged in a constant process of communication, if you will. So mm-hmm. you begin to realize that even the nature of your awareness is in constant communication with that hierarchy. You begin to understand, let's say, the telepathy, not just mental telepathy, functions all the way through. That mm-hmm. What I mean by that is that the ideas that you have aren't even necessarily your ideas. Mm-hmm. They're the capacity that you have to hold certain impressions that are being filtered through sacred world, if that makes sense. That the archetypal ideas of the planet, are not, they're not personal.
No, I do believe that we have creative agency. I'm 100% in alignment with you, but I think we're all endowed with the co-creative potential.
The creative potential is our ability to how we then work with that.
Yeah.
Right? How we work in a creative way with abstract ideas. That is a unique creative, but it's like, mathematics. This is the mind, the mind of God is mathematical, so to speak. So to think that you made up mathematics, no, you could be a highly creative mathematician.
Yeah.
Right. But the fundamental language itself. So anyway, sixth person, and then seventh person perspective, which in my mind is like then you're the graduating class. Like we're not of humanity. Like let's be honest. This is a rather backwater planet,
Yeah.
not a particular high level of development. So even our greatest realizers are like, going on to middle school.
Yeah, I always tell my students, got to realize the world is third grade.
Yes, third grade.
And the teachers that are here come here to teach, but they're teach, learn, teach, like Ra would say, And
right.
yeah, we're all on a rainbow bridge of evolution.
That's right, exactly. And so seventh person perspective would be where you that is holonic or logoic. So essentially at that level of development, your level of awareness fuses with the planet itself, and you realize the relationship between humanity out there and all of your sub-minds. So you realize that whatever you see out there are the parts within here.
Yeah.
And that's when a really mature bodhisattva realizes that there is no full realization of this body-mind without full realization of the planetary mind itself. So that holographic level of seventh person perspective, that's what Ken would call supermind. Right? So that's like the journey, along those, let's say, 7 perspectives.
Yeah, I like the way you framed it. It's easy to follow. I think it's very realistic. And you're one of the few people I've ever heard talk about the importance of our awareness of an embodiment of the sacred aspects of things like the environment that we're in, because it has such a huge influence on our perspective. Most people that write about these things speak of it, very objectively, like you're talking about, how you can hop up a car, for example, Yeah.
So what that tells me, there's a difference between seventh person perspective mentally and hitting that note all the way up the stack.
Yeah.
So somebody can learn the theory of perspective taking without necessarily the realizations that go with it, ideally. So you could, of course, know and understand, oh, wow, I'm a hologram of the whole. Okay, great. So that's a kind of a seventh person cognition in some ways. That isn't the same thing as actually, though, experiencing that as a direct knowing, as love, as what motivates you in your life.
Yeah.
And then also the way that you can also tell, Paul, is karmically, because there's a lot of assholes, well, in general, who believe that like at some point they learn about development and they think that getting higher is somehow better.
Right, of course. Yeah, that's very Western.
Very Western. But the way that I would tell of someone's soul maturity, and so another way of looking at this is about the development of the soul, and I could talk about that slightly differently. But the way I can tell about the development of the soul is based also on the relational field the person has woven. Which also means, so when this awakening process happens, there is a synchronistic process that the karmic connection, well, look, you and me meeting, okay?
Yeah.
Here's an example, two karmic streams meeting and people listening to that meeting right now. Okay, so to the extent that you and I have woven relationships through many times, you will have a richness of a field of relationship.
Yeah, I do. I feel you very clearly. Okay. I think I not only feel you, but I feel, I'm going to use a Jung slang term, I feel Philemon in you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like I don't just see John there.
Mm-hmm.
I see a soul that's old enough to have some depth, and it's not bubblegum. It's the one piece of meat. If you have it in your pocket when you're really hungry, it'll keep you alive because it's got
Correct.
nutrition in it. you
Yeah.
know?
So let's say we see that in each other, but I bet that you have a field of relationships like that. That you have that in your life.
That's my goal.
But okay. But that tells me something about your maturity as a soul that couldn't be faked.
No.
Because of the field of synchronicity and granted, if you were a hermit, that would be different. But we're not doing this as hermits.
No.
This lifetime we've been called to stage a revolution.
Yeah.
And to do that, like you ain't gonna fight a war. And I think it's important to say to our listeners that there's a number of metaphors of the story here. One is it's a divine comedy. One is that it's a love affair. One is that it's an adventure. But it's also true that it's a fucking war.
Oh yeah.
Right? Because in my mind, if children are having bombs dropped on them anywhere on the planet, it means we're still fighting the forces of darkness. And if we're fighting the forces of darkness, which isn't just a kind of metaphorical thing, then you better fucking know who your friends are, right? Because, my grandmother, who was a Christian Scientist as well, and I think I mentioned she was a strong influence on me. She was Dutch, and when the Nazis rolled in to Amsterdam and The Hague, the question is, brother and sisters out there, when that shit happens, and of course now, the Nazis aren't wearing polished boots, it's a lot more difficult to notice who they are.
Because they're wearing white jackets with
because they exist at 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th. They are all the way through. It's not just like, the nasty Christian fundamentalists, or the nasty woke people, or the nasty... It is a multi-dimensional, battle fought on all levels of development simultaneously.
Yeah, and that's why. That's why I think both of us do what we do. But that's why you really have to be awake at this time, because the number of ways to get lost and get damaged and get fucked up is pretty significant. I mean, the minefield is well populated today.
Well, I think this is the difference between realizing at some point that what we're talking about, listeners, is not like a hobby. At some point, you're going to realize that what we're talking about is essential and fundamental to actually your survival as a sovereign being and soul on this planet. Right. And if you don't get, there's so much going on right now that if you're not realizing that it's actually a matter of survival in a kind of level of who we are as autonomous, creative, sacred beings, if we don't realize it's actually we're at a time where that's going to, even that will be challenged. People are looking to take that away from us.
No shit, yeah. And I think too, one reason from my perspective that it's so important to develop your spiritual competencies, intelligences, and an openness to the subtle. Mm-hmm. Is because it's very, very easy to be polarized into fear, drop back in consciousness, and find yourself doing shit that you later wish the hell you hadn't done, like getting vaccinated and realizing now you're sick and you're dying, or you got turbo cancer because you lost your center. I think ultimately...
Can I jump into that there?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that this is listeners, this is what I meant about the importance of sacred world all the way through the stack.
Yeah.
Like if you come in at sacred world at fourth person perspective, is like, oh, I go to the yoga studio and I'm going to drink some drinks and do a little meditation.
Yeah.
You don't realize that there is sacred medicine at third person, and there is a sacred world. If you don't, and of course, you have to understand that sacred world has been actively suppressed. We have had a war in this civilization for more than 2,000 years.
Yeah. In fact, since you're a Druid, have you ever, I don't remember the author's name, I'm sorry, but there's a great book on shamanism called Breaking Open the Head. and it's got a whole section on the Druids.
Mm-hmm.
And it talks about how when the Christian church came to Ireland, they had this one problem. These Druids kept helping people become enlightened and educating them such that they were resistant to the Christian teachings and wouldn't buy into it. And so it talks about how the Christians sent all these, Christian soldiers out to kill them all, but they went up into the forests and it was hard to find them. So here's what was wild. I never learned this until I read this book. The Christian church then sent the soldiers out not just to kill them, but to clear cut the forests so they had nowhere to hide. And that was my first ever book to realize that the first clear-cut loggers in the world was the Christian church.
Mm-hmm.
So there's your loss of the sacred dimension.
Right, that's right. That's right. So why am I saying this? I'm saying this because, listeners, it's important to locate yourself in sacred world. It's important to understand that we have been fighting this battle for many, many centuries. It's important to understand that your history is woven through that. That isn't stuff that happened in the past to other people. It happened to you.
Yeah.
Why is that important? Because if you don't remember, and if you're not aware of sacred world, it's because it was traumatized out of you.
Yeah.
Okay, so when I sit down to do therapy with somebody, right? If you and Paul, when he sits down, like you're going to find out if the person has a bunch of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and there's no point trying to like get onto higher stages of development if the person has a bunch of trauma.
Yeah.
This is the problem that our culture and civilization face right now, because we don't realize that the sacred was taken. Our Western sacred tradition was stolen from us, right, and taken. Because we don't realize that the loss of your indigenous soul, dear listeners, right? You don't realize that. You have that as a trauma. And therefore, we can't see sacred world. So it's difficult to imagine a future with sacred world in it because you can't see it in your past. And this is one of the big problems that we have right now. So development is important, but without the sacred, it's in my mind, it's a distraction, right? Without the sacred.
Yeah, I agree very much so. And it can actually be even dangerous because
Absolutely.
as people climb the ladder of perspectives you've just described, if they don't have the sacred, they actually can gain the language to rope in a lot more people into something that actually is very different than what it looks like. And then you get a cult, you get an ism, you get, a lot of bad stuff like the green movement, right? Like the World Economic Forum is a good example of an illusion, right? That you get fancy talk that ropes people in because it plays on their heartstrings, but ultimately where you're really going has nothing to do with the sacred at all.
Yeah, so what I often say to my students is, well, okay, since we're here to help externalize the sacred into this realm, that's the biggest game in town, y'all. Not like trying to get somewhere else. It's actually to bring that else here. Mm-hmm. So then what is like the goal of a planetary system? Well, just like you and I, our planetary system, it wants to become a university planet of truth and beauty and goodness. What would be a university planet means where education and learning and growth is the center. Now, when humanity understands that that's what we're here to do, that's the goal of what a planet is to become a university of beauty, a university of goodness, a university of truth. Then you have a sense of like where we're headed, which isn't into some metaverse or some transhumanism.
Oh my God. By chance, have you read David Chalmers' recent book, Reality Plus?
I haven't, no.
That'll blow your fucking mind.
Yeah.
That'll show you just how freaking lost a person can get in a digital reality metaverse. I'm worried. As much as David Chalmers has done for the field of consciousness studies and all that, it's like I've been studying him long enough to watch him just become drunk and stoned on this digital illusion.
So this is
crazy. It's fucking mind blowing. I struggled to stick with it, but my philosophy is, as a therapist, it's my responsibility to study the disease so I understand what's happening. And when someone with that much acclaim gets that far down that rabbit hole, I get very concerned. So if you really want a case study, there's a good book for you. It's quite recent.
I'm just tuning into it now, and I'm just seeing that I'm just seeing intuitively that's what fifth person perspective looks like without any sacred.
That's exactly right, man. And it's scary.
It is scary. So this is why I like, this is also why we need a consciousness, like a sacred revolution, right? Development, yes, but we're talking about, sacred world and the restoration of, let's say the Western esoteric tradition, i.e. the tradition of sacred development, because development is more than that. We're talking about from matter to spirit. And actually, the bigger thing, Paul, as you know, is what's our relationship with matter? Do we think that matter is inert, or do we recognize matter as an expression of the mother consciousness? And that is also sacred.
I think matter is spirit moving slowly enough that you can interact with it.
Well, there you go. So if that's how you look at it, then your science is informed by that. I mean, the truth is let's just slip into AI for a moment.
God forbid.
Well, I mean, so here's the thing is that, the cycle of trauma and the cycle of healing, within the esoteric tradition, it's understood that this year is a very important year because the balance as to which way that wheel spins. Because whenever we get AGI, when we get artificial general intelligence, if it's an AGI that has been that understands the nature of the sacred, right? So if it's an AGI, if it's AI that understands exactly what you're saying, that the sacred, that the matter is spirit moving slowly, then it goes in the direction of alchemy, and it goes in the direction of, let's say, of the sacred. And the wheel, because that wheel is going to go super fast, it has the possibility of supporting all the endeavors that we're talking about. The situation right now is actually the likelihood is not that isn't going to happen, because the people who are the Faustians, if you will, who are warming themselves and dreaming of
total control.
So this moment in time is interesting because these two wheels, the possibilities of these two wheels, I think are going to be fought out in the next year or so, and where they go from there, because at some point one of them wins over the other. So, what we have to, it's very important, I talk to a lot of, I'm involved in engaging with technologists to the extent that they are willing to invite the sacred back into the discussion. We have the possibility of resurrecting bodies of knowledge that were lost.
I think the only way we can get to a sacred AGI is through quantum computation. because the other systems of artificial intelligence are all algorithm based, and that means they are encoded with human conscious behaviors and ideologies. And they've been trying to train these systems off of us for a long time. And as I said to Federico Fagin when I interviewed him, my podcast with him is out, but I said to him, it's a concern to me that they're using every phone, refrigerator, car, camera that they can get a hold of to train AI, but they don't realize they're training it off of us, and we are extremely destructive to each other and the planet. So you're kind of going in the wrong fucking way.
That's right.
So if you want to create a spiritual AGI, you have to have a quantum computational process that can get out of the algorithm. And to quote Einstein, he said, imagination is more important than thinking. Typical AI is just an information processor, but quantum processing can go into the imaginal realm, I believe.
Well, the way that I thought about this, Paul, is that, and you mentioned the I Ching earlier. My grandmother started training me in the I Ching when I was 12. So she was like your mother with me. And what I would say is that if you look at the algorithms of the I Ching, which they are a set of algorithms, however, they're based on an asymmetrical structure that is the language of change itself. So I think my sense is to the extent that we can, and this will happen, if the question is when, that we give these intelligences the gift of randomness. So to the extent that we allow their decision-making process to be based on the algorithmical mathematics of the I Ching, essentially, if you do that, you will invite the synchronic space of, if anybody here, any listener has worked with divination, you'll know that if you work with divination for a while, the randomness is not random at all. It's actually the expression of the synchronic order.
Yeah, so it is.
Yeah. I honestly believe that, there is a possibility any civilization that gets over this hump that we're in the right way will give birth to synchronic technology that is an expression of the synchronic order of how things unfold. Maybe we get there, maybe we don't. But I agree with you that our technology can be an expression of the best of what it means to be human, not the worst.
Yeah, it's almost like it's a race to see if we can get analog technology to reach the level. And I mean, we already have it because Mother Nature is far more advanced than our conscious processes. I think, like we talk about connecting to the sacred and really honoring the sacred, here we are trying to invent very advanced computing technologies, but we're not really paying attention to the fact that there's 100,000 biochemical reactions a second in every single cell in your body. We don't have anything that can even come close to that. So like we are, I've quoted this many times on my podcast, so forgive me if I'm boring you with Steiner's quotes, but I want to share it in this context because it's very important. Steiner said, human beings will continue to invent technologies outside of themselves until they either destroy the planet or realize that everything that they've created was an inferior copy of what is within themselves. The question is, which will come first? And so, this is why the inner arts, I think, are so important. It's why it's important to teach people how to learn to use their intuition, how to pay attention to their body, how to listen to your heart, how to listen to your instincts, because the level of technology that we call our bodies took an entire universe to put together. Steiner says, you are created by the angels, and they didn't just create you, they live in and breathe through you.
Beautiful.
Without them, you would not be alive at any moment. It's just that we have to come to the awareness of what spirit is and the fact that it's doing something magical. It's giving us complete free will to
Mhm.
take the path that we want to take for better or worse, and willing to sacrifice itself to that end,
That's right. Yeah.
right? But it's also embedding us with literally God consciousness and saying, here I am. Just look inside and you'll find it.
So yeah, I'm thinking something listeners, we come from technology, we bring it back to the technology of the heart.
Yeah.
So really, if this developmental process is an expression of the heart, and I think that one of the mistakes with the developmental models is they tend to be an ascending model.
Right.
And I don't see it this way. I see it that the heart is at the center, just like the heart chakra is at the center. And the heart grows and it sprouts up and it roots and it goes down. And as it goes down, it goes into the third and the second and the first chakra, and it goes up, it grows to the fifth and the sixth and the seventh. But actually, in the highest teachings, perennial wisdom of this planet, it isn't the crown that is the highest, it is the heart. Because when the heart becomes super strong, it can pull the crown and the root into it.
Yeah.
So it isn't an ascending, the model of ascending stages of development is useful, but what Paul and I are really pointing to here is this is about deeper levels of love, higher levels of love that can go down deeper and deeper into very matter itself, and love that can reach up, and love that can open wider and wider and wider, and love that has the courage to go forward. It's really all about, the wisdom, strength, expanse, rootedness of our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
That is safe development.
Yeah. Jung says no tree can reach to heaven until its roots reach to hell. And the point I'm bringing that up for is it's like it's up to each of us to say, okay, how much hell do I need before I realize there's got to be a better way? And one thing I learned a long time ago is you can't do anything meaningful on this planet by yourself.
No.
And if you don't make it into your heart and learn to love and appreciate and respect not just other people, but all sources of life and intelligence, then you're not going to get to the meaningful that we need to make it through this valley of shadows and darkness that we're walking through. The question is how broken are we going to have to get before we awaken to our possibilities, or get so traumatized that we just don't want to live anymore. And that's it's a
big question, Paul.
Steiner said that what's going on right now, he calls this the incarnation of Ahriman.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And he says that we from a spiritual perspective, we're here to learn by going so deeply into matter that we come to the realization that there is a spiritual dimension to life, and that we must overcome our addiction to matter, or we will not. If we don't do it authentically, then we won't become truly spiritual people. Mm. So he says the question is, how much of Ahriman is it going to take to get you to really realize that the Ahrimanic deception is ultimately, it ultimately ends in destruction of the whole planet, is what happens.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that from the kind of contemplative perspective that I work from, really what I take from the particular thing that I take from there is the term addiction, because the cycle of suffering, the cycle of misery, which is a cycle of multi-generational trauma. The thing is we become addicted to the trauma, right? We become addicted biochemically. Yeah. We become addicted to the kind of the arms industry, the whole political kind of civilizational structures that we're using to, to maintain our wealth. Clearly, the reason why, we have students is because, this is the time to, to prepare and to train for how do we overturn this? Because we all realize that it has to stop.
Mm-hmm.
But we also realize that, my God, if it does, that in itself is going to be a massive challenge. so the very thing that in one sense that we would wish that if that happened would be such a challenging process that in fact we actually have to train to be able to be the kind of people to have the grace of having that kind of exit. In order to have the transformation the planet needs, we all need to really, we clean up, we need to grow up, we need to wake up, as our friend Ken Wilber would say.
Show up.
And realize that it's going to take everything. It's not going to be it's not a hobby.
Well, I think a simple way to put it in a conceptual metaphor, because people listening might be thinking, well, how could it be hard for us to come into our hearts and love each other? Why would that be so hard? But I think if I interpret you correctly, the way I would phrase it is ask yourself if you can handle a month without a cell phone.
Mm-hmm.
And see if you're willing to actually do the work to walk to people and talk to them and have conversations instead of texting them. See if you're willing to actually start using a compass instead of asking your phone how to tell you how to get everywhere. See if you're willing to learn to read a map. See if you're willing to learn to pay attention to the forest and find water.
Mm-hmm.
See, that's kind of the challenge, because depending on how far we go before we wake up, the level of destruction could be at that point where it's okay, now we've learned to love, but now we don't know, now we're still neophytes because we don't know how to live.
I think, yes, and I think the other thing is let's say the horn hasn't yet been blown. But let's say the horn does get blown. Okay, so what that means is let's say, listeners, that there are beings out there there is a plan.
Yeah.
Say that there are like bodhisattvas above your grade.
There are. I've met plenty.
There are plenty. So the question, so what I would say, friends, is when the horn is blown, are you going to be willing? Are you going to be able to serve because are you going to be capable enough? I don't think it's going to get. I think we're going to get to a place where the horns do get blown, right? Because part of the strategy, if you will, of the bodhisattvas is to stay clandestine for as long as possible.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you're like waving your flag, we're gonna make a change. That's not gonna.
Well, it'd be like having your daughter in gymnastics, and every time she goes to flip, you jump in and try to grab her so she doesn't get hurt. She won't learn anything.
Well, she won't learn anything. And also our dear friends, our dear adversaries on the other side. The only way that we have a change is we pull off something so outrageous and audacious, something so beautiful, good, and true that they had no, where the hell did that come from? So I think it's important just to know that there are beings beyond our own level of maturity, and to recognize that when the time for the horn gets blown, it's like, okay, it's time to move, because right now we're not there, but we will be.
Yeah, and I'll share with you and the listeners how I address that issue, because it's very, very hard. Like, let's say you and I came up with the perfect plan to educate enough people to tip the balance on the people that we're talking about. You'd have to do a hell of a lot of work, and it would be a freaking miracle to get that many people to change their behaviors, to do the practices. But the thing I tell every time I start one of my sanghas for my practitioners each week, we spend time just breathing unconditional love into our heart, filling our hearts with love. And as we exhale, we open our hearts and we pour that love into the world and we say, I give God's healing love to all beings. And when you look at the Global Consciousness Project and how they showed random event generators are very, very synchronized by events like Princess Diana dying, the Super Bowl. I actually did research on this. And what I found in my research was that 1 million people in coherence is stronger than 6 billion people out of coherence. So if we potentially could get 1 million people to come into a state of heart coherence, it could create a shift of consciousness on the planet that would literally be like an upswell of wind lifting a kite sailor right up.
Yeah,
I don't think of any other way to do it except that, because we can use the non-local field to be one without having to sit in meeting halls and read books.
Amen, Paul. I honestly believe that will be one of the approaches, for sure, right? Absolutely. I mean, I think the problem with the research, if we look at the Maharishi research on like the Maharishi effect, right, the square root of 1% of the population, which is what you're alluding to here. The problem with their research and their meditators is they were going too high on the stack. So if you open up the crown chakra and that's what you're radiating, fine, you'll create peace in the environment. But the minute you stop doing that, it won't stick. So listeners, what we do know, if meditators come together in environments, there's been extensive research, it changes the field. However, the question is really what kind of meditation to do to deeply affect the field. Because if you go too high, it doesn't actually stick. So Paul is talking like the heart coherence is one of the dimensions. The other thing that I've been working on is how do you work with integrating, and I'll talk about this some other time with you, the psychodynamic principles of early attachment, which are like trust and attunement and safety.
Yeah.
If you actually plug those in, the reason why there's the majority of trauma on the planet is unprocessed is because of the lack of safety and the lack of attunement. So if you mix those into the coherence of the heart, you create the right mixture harmonically and coherently, not only to create coherence from the heart, but to go down the stack and essentially address the dysfunction of the first and second chakra, which is where most of the trauma is being held in humanity right now. So we have to use a kind of a harmonic sensitivity to dial that. So the thing is we know how to do it. Now it's more just a question of how do you get together to kind of make something like that happen?
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I'll tell you my response to that. And this is what I tell my students. I say, look, it's so important to practice making love and taking responsibility for doing that within yourself.
Yeah.
Like when I do my morning practice of heart breathing, like I just described, I get as high as I get on 3 grams of mushrooms, except there's no drugs.
Sure.
And I feel open and connected. And that's what I do before I start communicating with my soul. So I know that none of the shadow parts of me are getting involved because I'm working from that heart center with clean intention. And the point is that we don't really get taught how to make love.
I agree.
We are waiting for someone else to give it to us.
Yes.
And no matter how broken you are, I've done this with countless very broken people. And I find that the more they feel safe within themselves to love themselves, the more they feel safe to give and receive love from others. And I think if a person's capacity for love is first grade, but their magnitude of wounding is 10th grade, then you got to grow the love, because you have to have enough love in you to dig down deep enough to get to the roots of that healing. But if you don't love yourself, you just want to take a drug and be a victim, because it's the only thing that takes the pain away. But if you pour your love into really taking responsibility for loving yourself, then you're learning how to make love. And then that, I feel, starts cracking all the bondage apart. It starts opening you up to possibilities. And you begin to realize dogs love you, cats love you, trees love you, plants. And once you start, then you can start opening up into the sacred dimensions of the world, and you realize, wow, Mother Nature's rooting for us all the way. Like, I often talk to plants and trees and house spirits, and one of the most common things they say is, where did all the people go that used to talk to us? And I say, oh, you mean the natives? Yes. I said, I'm sorry, but they're all dead. They said, now all we hear is machines, and everybody wants to cut us down and kill us.
Yeah.
It never used to be that way. I mean, I've had this conversation many times with plant and tree spirits, and it's really sad. And this is exactly why Gebser warns that you must transcend and include, or you are going to create trouble for yourself.
Or include and then transcend.
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to include what you have to transcend. Yeah, I think you and I know what each other mean. One more question before I let you go, because it's getting pretty late for you there. One of the things I've seen consistently happen is when people, for example, are in training with people like someone like me or you, and they grow, let's call it one chakra level of consciousness beyond their partner in a relationship. I find if their husband's third chakra dominant and they get to the fourth, they can still navigate it. But if someone gets beyond one chakra, I have seen relationships just blow apart because they don't seem to meet on values. They seem to have such a different worldview. And also the one that evolves tends to think that they are like having to mother the other one up, and they just don't feel compatible anymore. Have you witnessed that?
Well, I mean, that's true. I mean, that's the truth. I think it's also true that, you know, we all have parts. So I think that's true, but also partial, because just because you've evolved doesn't mean you have a bunch of other parts that have evolved. So, you know,
no, I think it has to do a lot with values, a shift in values perception.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that's true. That happens. I mean, just trying to keep a relationship going in and of itself, there's nothing virtuous about that.
Yeah, I the most common thing I tell people that come into counseling with me over these issues, I say, you know, what you want to do is love the person for who they are. Just because you're into meditation and everything else doesn't mean they have to be. I mean, who is the person that you fell in love with and why? And try not to forget that. And you know, that kind of there's a tendency for the ego to want to make everybody else do what it's doing.
Well, that's where I was going to get to, is that, yeah. I mean, yes, you can look at it that way, but also the truth is we're all here to serve each other.
Yeah. So
if somehow like you're more evolved now and you want to hang out, I mean, there's still a fuckload of me there. So, you know, the question really is like, okay, you know, and there's no right choice here. Like, you can choose to stay in a relationship and actually deepen your practice by relating, as you're saying, with deep love and care and presence.
Acceptance.
Right? And acceptance. And actually that will deepen your selflessness, because it's not actually, this is again, Paul, this goes out, I don't equate levels of development and values with actually sacred, because you could just be a more evolved wanker to give, right? And like, oh, I'm evolved now, and my husband doesn't, you know, use crystals and what have you. But right, it's just a bunch of selfing going on. So
yeah, that's what I meant, right? With the ego getting involved.
A bunch of ego. So I think for me, it's really got to do with, you know, to what degree have I worked through in the relationship my ego and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And I might work through it all and realize I really love this person and it's great, or I love this person and it's time for me to move on. But whether you're in the relationship or not in the relationship isn't the issue. The issue is, it always comes down to, to what degree is there ego grasping and addiction, and to what degree is there like open-heartedness and warmth and love and caring.
Yeah. And then also a lot of these relationship problems go back to unhealed traumas, bending your perception
Always.
of everything.
Always.
Well, John, wow, what a great dialogue. Thank you so much for joining me. I've had a lot of fun and some great laughs with you. I know you're healthy because you say fuck. Where can people find you, and anything you'd like to share as we close?
That's sweet of you, Paul. Well, my website, planetaryDharma.com. And let me see. I mean, the trainings I offer are like, they're multi-year long trainings. If people are interested, I think we're doing an introduction to Planetary Dharma July 18th to the 20th. And then, typically we bring a cohort on every year. And right now it's a 4-year program. And then that kind of gives you entrance to, let's say, the next level of training beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, we've had a great tour of a lot of important concepts today. We've had
for inviting me, Paul, and it was great to get to meet you.
You too. We had our nose right against the window of reality for a few hours here.
Yeah, that's right.
I'll tell you, you have to, I tell people all the time, you got to not lose your sense of humor about this. Otherwise, it can just get it can give you an ulcer, Yeah.
It would give you an ulcer.
Yeah. I always say to people, don't forget God loves it all. So you got to embrace it and use it as a catalyst for growth, or it'll eat you up and spit you out.
Yeah. Yeah.
But anyhow, John, thank you. I'm going to say thanks to our listeners for joining us on this amazing journey today. Thank you to the sponsors. Yeah.
Time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you to my sponsors for all your amazing products and all the love you give to organic farmers, biodynamic farmers, and free range farmers. And so when you buy from the sponsors, you're caring for the planet, you're caring for yourself, and you're putting a little commission to help me keep the podcast going. So it's a triple win-win-win, baby. And I don't bring anybody on that doesn't meet my values, which are very high and holistic. So you can feel safe in that. And I will look forward to sharing something exciting. It'll be hard to top John, but we'll see what we can do next week. John, one great big Bodhi hug to you, man. Aho.
Aho, mate.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Dr. John Churchill. Visit John's website at planetarydharma.com to find out more about his work and upcoming courses. That's Planetary Dharma, spelled DHARMA.com. Connect with him on Instagram at Planetary Dharma. If you are looking for a community where you can share ideas and ask questions about the topics discussed in this podcast, then check out Paul's Spirit Gym program and community. Memberships start at less than $8 a month, and you get access to exclusive members-only opportunities from Paul's guests, live Q&A sessions with Paul and with his guests, access to the podcast members forum within the Spirit Gym community where you can interact with other passionate listeners, and the chance to purchase exclusive Spirit Gym merchandise. You can subscribe today by going to paulchek.com/podcast or explore the higher levels of membership at myspiritgym.com. And finally, if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice. This podcast is available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.